Hey guys, tonight we slip softly into the drifting sands of Egypt, a place where the moonlight glows silver over endless dunes and the Nile whispers its secrets through the reeds. You lie back, and instead of your own bedroom ceiling, you imagine yourself staring up at walls painted with gods' jackal-headed guardians and falcon-eyed kings looming above you in flickering torchlight. The air is thick with resin and incense, like someone left a stick of sandalwood burning just for your arrival. It feels calm, almost hypnotic, but also a little unsettling, because here in this ancient kingdom, the rulers who strutted like gods weren't exactly the poster children for healthy lifestyles. In fact, you probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes in their court unless you happen to enjoy sibling weddings, crocodile dung beauty products, or being buried alive as a loyal servant. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I always love imagining our little community stretched across different time zones, like stars blinking in the desert night. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin your walk at the very threshold of a palace. Imagine golden columns rising high, their tips painted blue to mimic the sky, their bases planted with lotus carvings that seem to bloom eternally. Sunlight catches on gilded doorways, glinting so brightly it forces you to squint. Servants bustle at your feet, brushing away dust with palm fronds, so your sandals never touch dirt. You've barely taken 5 steps, and already you realize you're standing inside the glittering cage of the Pharaoh, a world where opulence drips from every surface. But beneath the surface, you sense the shadows lengthening. The truth is, pharaohs weren't just rich kings and queens, they were treated as literal gods. The people believed each pharaoh carried within him, or occasionally her, the living spirit of Horus, falcon of the sky. That's a lot of pressure, right? It's hard enough being someone's boss at work. Imagine being blamed if the Nile floods too little or too much. Sorry guys, my bad. I didn't appease the crocodile god properly. That's your Monday morning meeting. And yet outwardly, every corner of their world screamed wealth. Walls of polished limestone gleamed in the sun, as though Egypt itself was trying to outshine the heavens. Gardens spilled over with imported trees from Syria, frankincense, myrrh pomegranates, all carefully watered by irrigation channels that hummed like miniature rivers. Exotic animals were kept in palace menageries. Giraffes, baboons, and leopards paraded in decorative collars, the ancient version of flexing on Instagram. Every meal was a buffet of honey cakes, roasted geese, and freshly caught Nile perch. Yet amid these luxuries, the pharaoh's gaze was always fixed on death, eternity, and the dark unknown. The contradiction is jarring to the outside eye. You see gold shimmering everywhere, but inside the royal chambers whispers echo spells, incantations, prophecies, all obsessing over how to outwit mortality. Pharaohs lived every day, preparing for the day they wouldn't. You can almost hear the scratching of scribes' reed pens as they record elaborate rituals, or the murmured prayers of priests who assure the king his afterlife Wi-Fi signal will be strong enough to stream forever. Historians still argue whether this obsession with eternity made Egypt stable for 3,000 years, or whether it trapped its rulers in cycles of paranoia and extravagance. On one hand, that fixation built pyramids that still dominate our imagination today. On the other, it left behind empty treasuries, exhausted workers, and dynasties twisted by their own need to look divine. And in this moment, standing in the grand hall with painted ceilings and lotus-scented air, you start to feel that duality, glitter and shadows, immortality and fear, splendor and decay. You walk further into the palace and the soundscape shifts. Outside, you heard birds fluttering through papyrus groves, but inside the air hums with quiet ritual. Priests in linen robes glide across polished floors, their bald heads shining with oil. They carry trays of offerings, dates, figs, and small alabaster jars of perfume, lifting them towards statues of falcon-headed Horus and ibis-faced Thoth. You pause, almost holding your breath, because you realize this is not just decoration. This is daily survival for the pharaoh. Every gesture here is theater carefully choreographed to reinforce the idea that the king is more than flesh and bone. Even his sandals are symbols painted with images of bound enemies, so that with every step he is trampling chaos. Imagine living in shoes that constantly remind you of your power to crush people. It's a fashion statement, but also a psychological shield. But the glittering surfaces conceal anxieties. Because here's the thing, when you're told since birth that you're half God, you don't get the luxury of doubting. You must live up to cosmic expectations. If the Nile fails to rise high enough, crops shrivel and famine spreads. And who gets blamed? Not the weather, not the climate. It's you, the divine ruler, the man whose very breath is supposed to keep the sun crossing the sky. You feel 1,000 eyes watching, from peasants to priests, all silently judging whether you are still favored by the gods. This burden shaped the pharaoh's daily existence into something almost unbearable. Yes, he feasted at banquets. Yes, he wore crowns encrusted with lapis lazuli. But at the same time, he was locked in a prison of rituals. Every morning, he had to be purified with cold water, anointed with sacred oils, and dressed in layers of ceremonial clothing. His first meal wasn't even his choice. It was dictated by tradition. Even the way he sneezed had omens attached. Imagine needing priests to reassure you that your seasonal allergies didn't anger Ra. And behind this spectacle lurked the strangest paradox of all. The pharaoh worshipped as a god was also terrified of dying. He knew that beneath the layers of gold and the perfumes and the songs, his body would still decay. He saw it happen to his father, and his father's father, embalmed and wrapped, entombed beneath mountains of stone. So he prepared endlessly, commissioning tombs the moment he took the throne, rehearsing funerary rituals, hoarding treasures for an afterlife he could never be sure would welcome him. That's why you, standing here in the palace, sense a kind of tension in the walls themselves. The murals shimmer with color, but if you look closely, cracks run through them. Paint flakes off in corners, exposing the raw plaster beneath. It's almost symbolic perfection on the surface, fragility just under the skin. Picture yourself following the pharaoh into his private chambers. The hallway's narrow ceilings press lower and torchlight throws long shadows on the walls. Here the opulence softens. Instead of gold, you see clay jars holding ointments, piles of papyrus scrolls recording omens, amulets strung together like a nervous child's bracelet. The king himself, stripped of public grandeur, mutters to priests about dreams and anxieties. Did he see an eclipse last night? Did a hawk fly north instead of south? These are not the worries of a carefree ruler. These are the tremors of a man carrying the crushing expectation of eternity. It makes you think maybe the greatest tragedy of the pharaoh wasn't that he lived in excess, but that he could never escape the performance. Day and night, from his first breath to his last, he was the center of a drama bigger than any one life. And like all great dramas, it demanded both glitter and shadow. As you linger in those shadowed chambers, another truth becomes clear. The pharaoh's grandeur wasn't his alone. It was a machine, and it demanded fuel. And that fuel was people, thousands of them. Step outside again, beyond the palace walls, and you see them everywhere. Lines of workers hauling limestone blocks under the brutal sun. Scribes hunched over tablets, sweating ink stains into their linen. Farmers in the fields, bent double, coaxing barley out of stubborn soil. Each one of them labors not just for survival, but for the glory of a single man at the top. To the pharaoh, they are anonymous hands building his eternity. To history, they are the invisible foundation of the god-king illusion. And yet, despite all this suffering, the myth worked. Most Egyptians truly believed their ruler was divine. They bowed when he passed, they offered prayers to his statues, they spoke his name with trembling reverence. Was it faith? Was it fear? Probably both. After all, if the entire world around you, from temple walls to children's lullabies, tells you the king is a god, what reason would you have to doubt it? But here's the haunting part: many pharaohs leaned into this belief, not just with devotion, but with paranoia. Imagine knowing that your godhood rests on endless rituals, fragile crops, and the loyalty of priests who might whisper behind your back. Some rulers grew tyrannical, lashing out at imagined threats, rewriting history to erase rivals, or plastering their own names over monuments built by others. Others turned inward, chasing immortality through darker, stranger means. Take Akhenaten, for example, who abandoned the old gods and forced everyone to worship just one, the Aten, the sun disk. He reshaped Egypt's religion overnight, claiming himself as the sole interpreter of divine light. For ordinary people, it must have felt like the sun itself had been stolen and resold through the king. Or consider Ramses II, who carved his face into colossal statues across the land, as if sheer size could outlast death. These weren't just acts of vanity, they were desperate insurance policies against the oblivion every pharaoh secretly feared. And so the glittering palaces, the banquets, the gold, these were not luxuries in the modern sense. They were shields, shields against chaos, against doubt, against the relentless march of time. The pharaoh ate honey cakes not just because they were sweet, but because sweetness itself became a symbol of divine favor. He wore lapis crowns not just for fashion, but because the color blue was believed to embody the heavens. Even love and family were bent into the performance. Marriages between siblings reinforced the idea of godlike purity, though to us today it reads more like a nightmare of entrapment. Pause here for a second. Imagine lying back again, looking up at those palace ceilings painted with stars. Feel the incense thicken in your lungs. You might almost admire the pharaoh, this fragile man who dared to hold himself up as eternal. But then the cracks return to your vision. You see the strain in his eyes, the muttered prayers, the endless rehearsals for death. He was no god. He was just a man trapped in a golden mask. And maybe that's the most chilling realization of all the pharaoh's life, for all its splendor was just as haunted by mortality as ours. All his pyramids, all his treasures, all his rituals, none of it stopped his body from crumbling into dust. The gods he claimed to embody left him behind, and now, thousands of years later, we walk among his ruins, piecing together his fears like archaeologists of the soul. So as you drift back into the calm of your own room, let the thought settle. Egypt's golden kings weren't untouchable divinities. They were men performing eternity, draped in gold, sweating, under crowns too heavy for any human skull. And in that weight, we see not their godhood, but their humanity. The sun is just beginning to rise over the Nile. Its light is soft, a pale gold, spilling across the river's surface. But inside the royal residence, the day has already begun. Long before the first farmers dip their hoes into the soil, the pharaoh is awakened not by the warmth of sunlight, but by the soft footsteps of priests. They enter his chamber in silence, carrying bowls of cold water drawn from sacred pools. These are no ordinary baths. This is purification, the symbolic washing away of chaos. Imagine yourself half asleep, but instead of stretching and yawning, you are stripped, splashed with icy water, rubbed with perfumed oils, and chanted over by holy men. This isn't comfort, it's obligation. Before the pharaoh even tastes breakfast, his body is turned into a vessel of cosmic order. And then comes the wardrobe. Not a simple change of clothes, but a ritual layering of meaning. First, a plain linen kilt, bleached white to signify purity. Over it, depending on the occasion, might come leopard skin draped across the shoulder, symbolizing dominance over wild nature. Then a crown, sometimes the red crown of Lower Egypt, sometimes the white of Upper Egypt. And on rare days, the double crown uniting both. Every piece he wears has weight not just physical, but spiritual. A misplaced sash or a wrongly chosen crown could be read as an omen of disaster. Only after this ceremony of dressing can the king move to his first meal. And even that is more performance than pleasure. Honey cakes, figs, pomegranates, roasted goose, foods believed to carry divine vitality. But the pharaoh doesn't eat in private like you or I. He dines under watchful eyes, servants hovering with trays, scribes recording offerings, priests muttering blessings. The act of chewing itself becomes a sacred spectacle. Imagine never taking a single bite without the world expecting it to mean something. Once fed and clothed, the true burden of his day begins the rituals of statecraft. Each morning, the pharaoh had to enter a temple and personally awaken the gods. Statues of deities carved in gold and lapis were treated like living beings. The king would symbolically open their eyes, clothe them in miniature garments, and present them with food. Not because the gods needed to eat, but because Egypt believed the entire cosmic balance life, death, harvest, fertility depended on these daily offerings. If he failed, the sun might not rise tomorrow. Think about the pressure of that. Every gesture, every word, every incense stick lit or extinguished. If anything went wrong, the weight of famine, plague, or war would be blamed squarely on you. And you couldn't delegate this. You couldn't call in sick. No matter how tired, no matter how sick, no matter how hungover from last night's banquet, you had to rise and keep the gods alive. But woven into this schedule of devotion were strange, almost theatrical rituals. For example, the pharaoh might ritually smite clay figures of enemies, breaking them into pieces to magically destroy foreign powers. He might shoot arrows into the sky to frighten away evil spirits. He might even participate in mock battles staged in palace courtyards, demonstrating to everyone from nobles to servants that chaos was always being beaten back under his rule. And yet beneath all this symbolism, the irony glows like fire under ash. These acts weren't just for the gods, they were for the people watching. A pharaoh's divinity was only as strong as the belief of those around him. So his daily life became a theater, staged and restaged day after day, year after year, to convince an audience that their fragile mortal king was eternal. Step deeper into the pharaoh's day, and you'll find that his life was a balance between suffocating ceremony and moments of eerie excess. After the morning rituals, he would often retreat to the Hall of Audience, a space designed not for comfort but for intimidation. Imagine a vast chamber of stone sunlight, funneled through narrow slits, hitting polished floors, so that visitors saw their own reflections trembling beneath them. Foreign envoys trembling, scribes and governors from far provinces would be ushered in, heads bowed to hear the pharaoh speak. But here's the twist: he rarely spoke at all. His silence was power. Words were filtered through priests or viziers, making him seem distant, otherworldly. If he did speak, every syllable was rehearsed and recorded as if spoken by a god rather than a man. Even the tone of his voice was considered sacred, too casual and the illusion cracked, too stern and it risked sowing fear among his own court. The weight of every sentence could ripple through the kingdom like a stone tossed into water. And then there were the petitions, farmers begging for reduced taxes during a bad flood year, soldiers requesting rewards for loyalty, artisans seeking patronage. For the pharaoh, these weren't mere appeals. They were reminders that every corner of Egypt depended on him personally. The Nile flooded because of him. The crops grew because of him. Children were born healthy because of him. And when something went wrong, it was a direct indictment of his divine competence. Imagine carrying that blame on your shoulders every season. By midday, the palace filled with the different rhythm banquets. entertainments and distractions. You might picture endless feasts, and yes, the pharaoh dined on delicacies few Egyptians would ever taste: grilled quail, fresh fish from the Nile, rare dates imported from distant lands. Wine flowed freely, often mixed with honey or spices. Music echoed through the halls, flutes, harps, and the low thrum of drums. Dancers performed acrobatic routines, their movements practiced to perfection. But beneath the laughter and music, another tension ran. Banquets were not just about pleasure, they were about control. Every guest was carefully chosen. Nobles watched each other's behavior, gauging favor and jealousy. Servants lingered, their eyes lowered, but their ears sharp. A single misstep at these gatherings, a careless remark, a failed toast, even a glance held too long could end in disgrace or worse. Poison was a constant fear. The king's cupbearers performed elaborate rituals to prove the wine safe sipping, first themselves before offering it. Now imagine the pharaoh himself at these feasts, surrounded by beauty, luxury music, yet forced to sit on a throne so stiff and formal it felt like a prison. He might smile, raise his cup, even laugh at a jest, but every moment was an act. To be too relaxed was dangerous. To be too human was fatal. His life was a masquerade, and the mask could never slip. Stranger rituals also crept into his day. The pharaoh was expected to participate in ceremonies that blurred the line between sacred and bizarre. In fertility rites, he might plow a symbolic furrow in the earth, imitating the gods who first created life. During festivals, he would appear in public processions where his body was displayed almost like a relic borne on litters by servants as people prostrated themselves in the dust. In one infamous ritual known as the Heb-Sed festival, the pharaoh, once he had ruled for 30 years, was required to run laps around a courtyard to prove his strength and vitality. Picture it, an aging king, weighed down by jewels and robes, forced to jog under the merciless sun, while priests and citizens chanted. If he stumbled, whispers would ripple like snakes. Perhaps the god in him was fading. The pressure of such performances cannot be overstated. Imagine your entire legitimacy hinging not just on governance, but on your physical stamina, your voice, your posture, even your ability to smile at the right moment. The pharaoh wasn't simply ruling, he was auditioning every single day for the role of eternity. And lurking behind these public acts was a constant paranoia. Were the priests loyal, or were they plotting to elevate another? Were the nobles grateful or quietly counting the days until a usurper struck? Even within his own household, the pharaoh could not rest. Wives vied for influence, children jockeyed for inheritance, concubines whispered alliances. A careless glance across a banquet table could ignite a palace intrigue that ended in assassination. So while the day glittered with ritual and gold, the shadows clung close. The pharaoh's daily life was not just about upholding the gods, it was about surviving the mortals around him. When the banquets quieted and the courtiers dispersed, you might think the pharaoh finally found rest. But night in the palace was no gentler than day. Darkness brought a different kind of weight, the weight of cosmic fear. Egyptian religion taught that every sunset was a rehearsal for death. As Ra, the sun god, descended into the underworld, he battled chaos itself. And the pharaoh, as Ra's earthly counterpart, was expected to mirror this journey. Sleep wasn't just sleep, it was a ritualized passage into the unknown. Before retiring, priests recited protective spells, ointments were applied, and sacred amulets were placed nearby to ward off demons that might strike in the night. Imagine living with the belief that even your dreams could be a battlefield where the fate of the cosmos trembled on your survival. Inside the pharaoh's private chambers, the atmosphere was thick with ritual. The walls themselves were painted with protective symbols, ankhs, scarabs, and stars mapped to guide his soul. Servants lit oil lamps infused with resins meant to repel spirits. The bed raised above the floor was carved with lion's paws to signify strength. Even the linens carried symbolic patterns designed not for comfort but for magical defense. Rest was never simple. It was an armed truce with the unseen. Yet for all the grandeur, there was also loneliness. Few could enter these sacred quarters. Wives, even queens, were not guaranteed a place in the pharaoh's bed. Often his nights were overseen instead by ritual attendants, silent figures who ensured the correct spells were spoken, who hovered at the edge of the room like shadows. Intimacy was rare. Duty took precedence. A king might sire dozens of children, yet still sleep surrounded by priests instead of loved ones. Paranoia also crept in at night. Poisoning was easiest when the body was most vulnerable. Food tasters and cupbearers were trusted by day, but at night the danger was subtler. Was the servant pouring water truly loyal? Were the guards outside his door bribed? Some pharaohs, like Ramses III, were betrayed in their very chambers, killed not on the battlefield, but in their beds, where they were supposed to be untouchable. Imagine the terror of lying down to sleep each night, knowing the dagger could come from your own household. Even when death didn't strike suddenly, the anticipation of it never left. The pharaoh's nights were filled with preparation for eternity. Scrolls of the Book of the Dead were read aloud as if rehearsing lines for a role in the afterlife. Ritual masks and miniature figurines were blessed and set aside, destined for his tomb. Every evening was a rehearsal for a future burial. For a god-king, life was just a prologue to death. The afterlife was the true stage. Picture the strangeness of this existence. By day, a king adored as a god lifted on golden litters, fed delicacies no peasant could dream of. By night, a man haunted by shadows, warding off invisible spirits, trusting no one, listening to priests murmur spells in the dark. Glory and fear intertwined until they were indistinguishable. This is the disturbing truth. The pharaoh's divine role was not a blessing, but a cage. The title promised immortality, but demanded constant sacrifice, of freedom of family, of peace of mind. The throne glittered like the sun, but its glow concealed chains. The life of a god on earth was in reality a life of exhaustion, paranoia, and suffocating ritual. By daylight, the pharaoh was a priest, a judge, a cosmic pillar holding Egypt steady. But when the sun dipped low and the court gathered in torchlight, another world emerged, the world of banquets. Imagine stepping into a vast hall inside the palace complex, its walls painted with bright scenes of lotus flowers, cattle processions, and gods feasting in the afterlife. The air is thick with incense smoke. curling upward to mask the stench of sweat and roasted meat. Musicians strum harps and pluck lutes, while young dancers clad only in beads and linen whirl to the rhythm of drums. This is no quiet dinner. This is theatre, a display of power through excess. For the pharaoh, the banquet was more than pleasure. It was politics staged on a golden table. Foreign envoys brought exotic foods as tribute: pomegranates from Canaan, wine from the Levant, honey from Nubia, spices carried across the Red Sea. Each bite proved Egypt's reach. Each cup of imported wine was a reminder to guests that the world bent toward the Nile. The feasts were less about feeding hunger and more about feeding prestige. The dishes themselves dazzled in variety: roasted goose oxen slow-cooked on spits, Nile perch baked with herbs, bread baked in dozens of shapes and mountains of dates, figs and pomegranates stacked high like offerings to the gods. Beer flowed freely, thick and sweet, while golden goblets of wine passed hand to hand. Servers moved in precise choreography, never letting a cup empty or a plate cool. A misstep in service could mean disgrace or worse, suspicion of sabotage. But behind this glittering spectacle, the truth was less appetizing. Overindulgence left many pharaohs bloated, arthritic, and diseased. Mummies of kings have revealed clogged arteries, dental decay, and obesity. The god kings worshipped as images of divine perfection were in fact suffering the very human consequences of excess. Imagine Tutankhamun, a frail teenager with malformed bones, being carried into a hall where the table groaned with food he could scarcely enjoy. Or Ramses II, in his later years, feasting grandly while his teeth rotted painfully in his skull. And always the eyes of the court were watching. Nobles laughed at the pharaoh's jokes, praised his appetite, and mirrored his gestures. To refuse his wine was insult. To outdrink him was dangerous. Banquets were carefully staged performances where every toast reinforced loyalty and every song sung by musicians whispered flattery. Beneath the laughter, silence lingered. Who among the guests might harbor resentment? Who was plotting a spilled cup or an accidental cough? Could sour the mood, shifting the air from celebration to suspicion in an instant. Even pleasure became a burden. The pharaoh could not eat or drink like a free man. He had to consume as a king, endlessly proving his wealth and divinity through mouthfuls of meat and gulps of wine. And yet each indulgence weakened him further, turning his body into a mirror of the kingdom's fragility. The banquets glittered in the torchlight, but they carried a shadow, the shadow of decay, disease, and silent treachery at the table. If the food and drink dazzled the senses, the entertainment amplified the spectacle. The pharaoh's banquets weren't silent affairs of nobles chewing politely. They were orchestrated performances designed to overwhelm. At one end of the hall, musicians played harps taller than a man, their strings thrumming in hypnotic rhythm. Flutists wove thin melodies above the bass of frame drums. Young girls trained from childhood danced barefoot on polished floors, their arms twisting like lotus stems, their linen skirts swaying to the beat. Every step was a gesture of submission to the king, every song a hymn to his glory. But notice the duality. While these entertainments delighted, they also reminded guests of hierarchy. The dancers were servants, the musicians expendable, and their very presence highlighted the distance between ruler and ruled. The pharaoh's laughter at a jest or his applause for a song could change a performer's fate. A mistake might cost them their life. For those serving the banquet was not joy, it was a tightrope walk above disaster. Then came the rituals of drunkenness. Egyptians valued beer and wine not just as drink, but as pathways to altered states of being. At these feasts, intoxication was a form of worship, mirroring the myth of Hathor, the goddess who once drank blood-red beer until she was pacified from her rage. Pharaohs drank to embody the gods, but the results were rarely divine. Staggering kings, slurred speeches, and even violent outbursts stained these sacred celebrations. In some accounts, nobles had to be carried out vomiting behind pillars, while scribes carefully recorded the pharaoh's every word as if they were sacred decrees. Imagine the chaos, golden cups tipping, music rising to mask the sound of retching, while priests insisted this excess was holy. The banquet table also doubled as a stage for politics. Allies were seated close to the pharaoh. Rivals placed farther away, their distance from the king, a visible reminder of their waning influence. An empty chair might symbolize a fallen general or a purged noble, his absence more telling than any speech. Foreign envoys often sat at the edges watching, as Egyptians indulged in extravagance meant to intimidate. They returned home carrying tales of overwhelming abundance, but also whispers of a king so glutted on wine and meat he could scarcely walk. And then lurking beneath it all was the constant threat of poison. The pharaoh's cupbearer was both servant and guardian, trusted to taste wine before the king. A slip of hesitation, a flicker of fear in the servant's eye, could turn the room cold. Banquets had the potential to become execution grounds where a single dish might carry death. Even trusted wives and sons were not above suspicion. After all, it was at a royal gathering that Ramses III was targeted in the famous harem conspiracy, when assassins plotted to kill him during what should have been a scene of joy. For the guests, the pharaoh's table was an opportunity and a trap. To be seen drinking with the king was an honor. To refuse could be seen as treachery. Conversations were carefully measured, every toast calculated. A noble might rise from his seat to flatter the king with a poem or a pledge of loyalty, but say one word out of place, and the feast could turn against him. The laughter that filled the hall was rarely carefree. It was strained, tense, always listening for the king's reaction. And when the night dragged on, the room often dissolved into something darker. Torches guttered, food grew cold, and the drunkenness tipped into debauchery. Bodies collapsed onto cushions, voices slurred into incoherence. The pharaoh, now less god and more man, might reveal moments of weakness, a confession, a violent mood swing, or even a glimpse of fear. Those closest to him had to pretend not to notice. For a god-king to be human was the greatest shame. Thus, every banquet, no matter how joyous on the surface, carried the burden of danger, disease, and political theater. Pleasure and paranoia shared the same goblet, and the pharaoh was forced to drink deeply from both. When dawn finally broke after a night of revelry, the palace did not smell of divinity. It reeked of spilled wine, rotting food, and the bodies of courtiers who had drunk themselves insensible. Servants moved quietly through the wreckage, clearing goblets, collecting bones, sweeping away wilted lotus petals that yesterday had symbolized eternity, but now lay trampled into the floor. For the pharaoh, the banquet ended not with satisfaction, but with aftermath. His stomach churned, his body swollen and aching. Many kings carried the evidence of these nights in their flesh. The analysis of royal mummies has revealed gout, heart disease, obesity, and even calcified arteries, diseases of excess rarely seen in the common farmer who ate simple bread and onions. The irony was bitter. The very people who labored under the sun to fill the pharaoh's tables often lived healthier lives than the god-king who consumed their tribute. The priests, ever eager to maintain the illusion of divinity, reframed these ailments as signs of sacred mystery. A king's bloated form was not gluttony, they said, but divine abundance. His failing teeth were explained away as the mortal price of carrying a god's burden. In truth, the royal body was breaking down under pressure and indulgence. Power demanded not only wealth, but its constant display, and the feasts demanded that the king perform vitality even as it drained him. But perhaps the greatest burden of the banquet was not physical, but psychological. The pharaoh could never simply eat as a man among men. Every meal was staged, every sip scrutinized. He dined not in freedom, but under 1,000 watchful eyes. To eat was to govern, to drink was to command loyalty. The table was as much a throne as the golden chair in the audience hall. This constant performance exacted a cost. Some pharaohs grew paranoid, refusing to eat unless food had been blessed and tested. Others retreated into ritual surrounding their meals with prayers and offerings, trying to cleanse the poison of suspicion from every bite. Even in moments of supposed joy, fear never left the table. It sat between the plates, invisible but always present. Meanwhile, outside the palace walls, the contrast was stark. Farmers labored in the fields, eating coarse-bred onions and beer. Simple meals that sustained them for long days under the sun. They worked to exhaustion so the pharaoh could sit in luxury chewing tender goose flesh and sipping imported wines. The banquet hall glittered with gold, but its foundation was built on the hunger of thousands. Every bite the king took was an echo of someone else's toil, someone else's sacrifice. And so the banquet became a symbol of the pharaoh's paradox, celebrated as the pinnacle of earthly power, yet imprisoned in rituals that robbed him of health and peace. The feasts meant to display immortality, instead revealed fragility. The god-king's swollen joints, his rotting teeth, his drunken rages, they betrayed the man behind the crown. In the end, the feasts were not just about food or drink, but about illusion. They projected strength while hiding weakness, staged harmony while concealing rivalry, and promised abundance while masking exploitation. Guests left dazzled, whispering of the king's glory, even as they noticed the tremor in his hand or the hollowness in his laughter. And when the torches burned low, When the last musician's string snapped, when the king lay in his chambers groaning from indulgence, the truth became clear. The banquet was never a celebration. It was a burden the pharaoh could never escape. Behind the colossal statues and gilded tombs, the pharaoh's life was often strangled, not by enemies abroad, but by his own family within the palace walls. To the outside world, the royal family embodied harmony, husband and wife, depicted eternally embracing, on temple walls, children painted at their feet, everyone smiling in the timeless stillness of fresco. But the real palace air was thick with jealousy, suspicion, and fear. Marriage was rarely a choice of the heart. For most kings, it was a chess move. Queens were selected for political advantage, sometimes a sister to keep the bloodline pure, sometimes a foreign princess to cement peace with another kingdom. This practice of sibling marriage, shocking to modern sensibilities, was not a scandal in ancient Egypt. It was a strategy. By wedding his sister or half-sister, a pharaoh ensured that no outsider could claim the throne through marriage. Blood remained divine, untainted by foreign hands. But if it solved one problem, it created another. These marriages often turned toxic breeding rivalries between sisters, mothers, and children. The harem, far from being a place of pleasure, was often a battlefield. Multiple wives, concubines, and their children all jostled for the king's attention, each mother hoping to secure the throne for her son. Whispers of poisonings, betrayals, and conspiracies haunted the palace halls. Consider the case of Amenhotep III, who married Tiye, a commoner elevated to queen, but also filled his harem with foreign princesses sent as diplomatic gifts. Tiye, brilliant and strong-willed, held her own, but the rivalry simmered. Later, Akhenaten and Nefertiti presented an image of divine unity, husband and wife worshipping the sun disk together. But even there, jealousy and succession disputes bubbled beneath the surface. Children, too, were not merely children. They were pawns. A son could be groomed as heir, but still face assassination by rivals within his own bloodline. A daughter might be given as a bride to cement loyalty, her happiness irrelevant beside the needs of the throne. Love was a luxury the pharaoh's family could not afford. Every bond was entangled with politics, every embrace shadowed by calculation. The palace, therefore, was less a home and more a stage, one where every gesture carried meaning. A smile on a wall painting could mask years of resentment. A queen depicted standing at the king's side might have spent her real nights seething, fearing replacement. A child shown playing with toys in art might in reality be groomed for intrigue, whispered to by ambitious tutors about his destiny. What outsiders saw as harmony was often closer to a cage. The pharaoh was trapped by duty to marry, to produce heirs, to satisfy foreign alliances, and to manage rivalries among his own wives and children. Each day behind the facade of divine bliss, the god-king endured the very mortal chaos of family life, magnified 100-fold by power. And unlike the farmers who could marry for affection, argue in private, and raise their children in peace, the pharaoh never escaped the gaze of the court. His bed was political, his family was strategy. His love, if it existed, was always under threat. If the family of an ordinary Egyptian farmer could be described as a source of comfort, the pharaoh's family was more often a source of peril. The palace was less a sanctuary and more a labyrinth of intrigue. At its center was the king, surrounded not only by wives and children, but by half-siblings, ambitious uncles, scheming mothers-in-law and foreign brides with their own entourages. Each figure represented not affection, but potential threat. The harem in particular was a crucible of jealousy. To outsiders, the word suggests indulgence and pleasure, yet in ancient Egypt, it was a political prison disguised as luxury. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of women, wives, concubines, foreign princesses lived within its guarded walls. Each knew that her status depended entirely on her favor with the king. A smile, a gift, or a night in his bed could elevate her. A cold glance could banish her into obscurity. More dangerously, each child born of these unions carried a spark of dynastic legitimacy and therefore a reason for others to fear them. This tension could boil over into conspiracy. The most famous case is the harem conspiracy against Ramesses III. Historical records reveal how one of his lesser wives, Tia, plotted with her son to assassinate the king so that her child, rather than the queen's, might inherit the throne. Court officials, guards, even priests were drawn into the scheme. The plot was ultimately uncovered and the conspirators executed in brutal fashion. Yet the story exposes how fragile royal life truly was. The pharaoh, revered as a god, was not safe even in his own bedchamber. Such betrayals were not unique. Throughout Egypt's long history, palace records whisper of poisoned wine, smothered heirs, and accidents that removed inconvenient rivals. For every polished relief showing a serene royal family, there was a darker truth of mothers coaching their sons in treachery. Brothers watching each other with suspicion, and daughters sacrificed to alliances they did not choose. The psychological toll was immense. A pharaoh could not trust even his closest kin. To show preference for one wife might spark resentment among others. To elevate one child risked painting a target on his back. Even affection became dangerous. If the king openly adored one son, rival factions might move to eliminate him, fearing his rise. If he appeared too attached to a queen, enemies could undermine her influence by whispering that she was manipulating him. Love was a weakness to be weaponized, nor were women passive figures in this bloody theater. Queens like Hatshepsut seized power, outright ruling in their own names and sidelining potential male heirs. Nefertiti, long presented as merely a consort, may have co-ruled or even ruled independently after Akhenaten's death. Their strength was admired, but it also deepened rivalries. For every woman who rose another was cast into shadow, nursing resentment that might later flare into treachery. The royal children, too, bore immense pressure. Sons raised as heirs lived with the constant fear of elimination, their childhoods warped by paranoia. Daughters, often married off, as pawns, saw their fates sealed before adolescence. They might be wedded to their own fathers or brothers to preserve divine blood, or sent abroad to foreign courts where they became hostages to politics disguised as brides. In the end, the pharaoh's family was not a private circle of love, but a public stage of constant calculation. Rivalries that in an ordinary household might result in quarrels could here ignite revolutions. The very walls of the palace rang with ambition, every whispered word a potential spark. For the god-king home was not refuge. It was the most dangerous place of all. Amidst the splendor and chaos of the royal household, the greatest irony was that the pharaoh, surrounded by wives, children, attendants, and courtiers, often lived in profound loneliness. For though the palace was never silent, filled with the footsteps of servants and the whispers of advisors, true companionship was almost impossible. Every relationship was conditional. Every smile carried the weight of politics. Even within marriage, intimacy was strained by the expectations of divinity. The pharaoh was not a man in his wife's eyes alone. He was a god to be obeyed, revered, and displayed. Imagine the impossibility of vulnerability in such a setting. To confess fear, doubt, or grief to a spouse was not simply a personal risk. It could undermine the very foundation of his divine image. Records from the Amarna letters hint at this alienation. Foreign princesses sent to Egypt often wrote home, complaining of their treatment, describing themselves as isolated and ignored. For the pharaoh, these women were not partners, but symbols of alliances. If love existed, it was often secret, fragile, and overshadowed by obligation. One wonders whether Akhenaten, in his devotion to Nefertiti, found a rare form of genuine attachment, or whether even that famed partnership was in truth staged for power. Children offered little refuge. An heir was both hope and danger. Too close an embrace could spark court jealousy. Too distant, and the bond was lost forever. Some pharaohs buried multiple heirs before reaching old age, often through disease, but sometimes scholars suspect through palace intrigue. Imagine the silent grief of a father who could never mourn openly for fear of showing weakness, who might see the death of a child not only as personal devastation, but as a potential political earthquake. Loneliness, then, was the hidden cost of divinity. The farmers of the Nile could laugh with neighbors, quarrel with spouses, and play with children in simple sincerity. But the pharaoh could not. His very humanity had been stripped away by the crown. Even his emotions were dangerous. Too much love, too much anger, too much grief, and always someone watching, ready to twist them into a weapon. This isolation sometimes produced cruelty. Pharaohs who trusted no one often ruled with suspicion, lashing out at perceived enemies, both inside and outside the palace. At other times, it bred eccentricity, kings turning inward, consumed by private obsessions. Akhenaten abandoned the old gods and built a city for his new religion, perhaps seeking escape from a world where he felt perpetually besieged. Others, like the young Tutankhamun, were so tightly controlled by advisors and relatives that their personal desires are almost invisible in history, erased by the machinery of power. Even in death, the pharaoh's family life remained a staged illusion. Tomb paintings show harmonious households, husbands and wives hand in hand, children at play, eternal unity preserved in stone. Yet these were not snapshots of reality, but propaganda carefully constructed to hide the betrayals and grief that had torn the family apart. Death, like life, demanded the mask. In the end, the god-king's greatest punishment may have been to live surrounded by people yet never truly known, adored, yet never truly loved, worshipped, yet profoundly alone. His family, meant to symbolize stability, became instead a source of endless danger. And while ordinary Egyptians could cherish private joys, the pharaoh endured the bitter paradox of being human in a world that demanded he be divine. If the palace family was a nest of rivalries, the wider royal court was a hive of eyes. The pharaoh never walked unobserved. Every moment of his day unfolded under the watchful gaze of advisors, priests, scribes, guards, and petitioners. Privacy was not only rare, it was a threat to the system itself, for the illusion of the god-king demanded constant performance, a ceaseless enactment of authority. The court was structured like a pyramid beneath the throne. At its top stood the vizier, the pharaoh's chief administrator, who controlled taxation, justice, and the functioning of the bureaucracy. Below him, treasurers managed the kingdom's wealth, generals commanded its armies, and priests tended the gods. Every one of these officials owed his position to the pharaoh, but also wielded power so vast that the king could not ignore them. To rule was to balance between dependence and dominance. The pharaoh must trust these men to execute his will, while simultaneously fearing their ability to manipulate, conceal, or even overthrow him. Surveillance extended to ritual itself. At dawn, priests ritually awakened the statues of the gods with hymns and incense. At the same time, palace servants prepared the king, dressing him in linen, painting his eyes with kohl, adorning his brow with the uraeus serpent of sovereignty. Each gesture was witnessed. Each act of grooming was political theater. A stumble, a visible sign of illness, even a cough could ripple through the court like thunder. Whispers might spread. Was the god weakening? Was the kingdom in danger? This constant observation bred suspicion. Advisors jostled for proximity to the king, each claiming to be his truest servant, while undermining rivals with whispers of incompetence or treachery. A pharaoh had to read faces as carefully as battlefields. Who bowed too low, who avoided eye contact, who lingered a second too long near the royal table. A careless smile or word could mark a man for death, or if misjudged, leave a true conspirator unchecked. Even feasting, often imagined as a moment of relief, was a theater of anxiety. Banquets glittered with gold cups, roasted geese music and dancers, yet at the royal table every bite carried risk. Poison was a silent assassin, and tasters often sampled dishes before they reached the pharaoh's lips. Guests themselves were both companions and potential enemies, smiling as they plotted. The wine may have flowed, but trust did not. The scribes, too, formed part of this surveillance. They recorded everything: the king's decrees, his victories, his festivals. But their role was double-edged. They immortalized glory, but they also controlled memory. What they chose to write or erase could shape how the pharaoh would be remembered. A slighted priesthood might emphasize his failures. An ambitious general might inscribe his own victories more boldly than his king's. Even within his own lifetime, the pharaoh's story was being edited, polished, or distorted by others' pens. The weight of this endless scrutiny was crushing. Imagine waking each day knowing that 1,000 eyes measured every word, every gesture, every flicker of expression. Imagine living in a palace where silence could be read as weakness, laughter as arrogance, and kindness as softness unworthy of a god. The pharaoh was not only trapped by walls of stone, but by walls of perception, an invisible prison of expectations. The Egyptian court was more than a place of governance. It was a stage of intrigue, ambition, and betrayal. Each official who surrounded the pharaoh lived in a delicate balance between loyalty and self-preservation. For proximity to the throne meant immense power, but it also meant immense danger. A whisper against the king, a miscalculation in council, or even an ill-timed gesture could mark a man for disgrace, exile, or execution. Advisors were masters of masks. Outwardly, they presented themselves as humble servants of the divine ruler, bowing low and flattering his wisdom. Inwardly, many were strategists, calculating how to advance their families, secure landholdings, or position their sons for future offices. The vizier who stood closest to the pharaoh often acted as a gatekeeper, deciding who gained audience, which petitions reached royal ears, and which reports remained buried. In this role, he could shape not only the flow of information, but also the king's very perception of reality. This control made the pharaoh vulnerable. To live at the top of the hierarchy was to live in danger of manipulation. A false report about a rebellious province could send armies marching unnecessarily. A carefully crafted accusation could turn a loyal general into a supposed traitor. Even within the palace, factions formed: military men against priests, scribes against nobles, each vying for influence. The king, though clothed in divinity, was constantly being pulled by mortal hands. History gives us chilling glimpses of how deadly these games could become. At times, viziers or generals grew so powerful that they overshadowed the throne itself. In the Middle Kingdom, some viziers effectively ruled in the king's name, with the monarch reduced to a ceremonial figure. During the late New Kingdom, generals like Horemheb wielded such authority that he eventually claimed the throne outright. The god-king, theoretically omnipotent, could in practice become the pawn of those meant to serve him. Conspiracies were a constant shadow. The infamous harem conspiracy against Ramesses III illustrates this peril. A secondary queen seeking to elevate her son plotted with high-ranking officials, scribes, and even magicians to assassinate the king. Though the plot was uncovered and punished with executions and mutilations, the trial papyri reveal the uncomfortable truth. The very heart of the royal household could harbor treachery. The pharaoh, surrounded by servants and advisors, was never beyond reach of betrayal. And yet the system itself encouraged such danger. Officials who wished to rise had no path except through proximity to the king. To secure favor meant survival, to lose it meant ruin. Ambition therefore thrived, sharpening every gesture, every word. A single misstep could mean the end of a career or life. Thus, the court existed in a constant state of tension, a place where smiling faces hid daggers and every alliance was temporary. For the pharaoh, this meant living in paranoia. He relied on spies and informants, men who whispered reports from the shadows of banquets and temples. Guards watched not only the gates of palaces, but also the behavior of courtiers. The king might grant lavish gifts, gold collars, estates, titles, but he also demanded absolute vigilance. Mercy could be dangerous, suspicion was safer. Over time, many rulers hardened, trusting no one fully, not even their own blood. In this web of deception, the pharaoh's humanity shrank further. He became both master and prisoner, commanding all yet trapped by those who surrounded him. A god in name, but in truth, a man forced to live within an endless performance, his every choice distorted by layers of advisors who spoke with reverence but plotted with calculation. If surveillance and intrigue were constant, then their ultimate effect was to reshape the very character of kingship. No pharaoh could remain untouched by such a suffocating environment. The throne demanded not only strength, but a permanent mask, a public self so carefully crafted that the private self nearly vanished. Every gesture in court became a language of survival. When a pharaoh smiled, it had to be controlled lest it appear foolish or weak. When he frowned, it had to radiate divine judgment rather than human irritation. His words were measured, often delivered through ritualized phrases, so that no misstep could be twisted by enemies. In this sense, the court was not merely a place where the pharaoh ruled. It was a crucible in which his identity was burned, reshaped, and hardened into something nearly inhuman. This constant vigilance also limited freedom. A king could not wander the palace alone without suspicion. He could not confide his fears to advisors without risking exploitation. Even family ties, which should have been sources of comfort, often became political minefields. Wives were watched, sons were groomed or suspected, daughters were married off as pawns in alliances. To trust anyone too deeply was to open the gates of ruin. The pharaoh's body itself became a site of surveillance. Any sign of aging or illness was quickly noted and whispered about. Wrinkles or fatigue could inspire speculation that the gods were withdrawing their favor. This fear often pushed rulers to project youth and vigor, even into old age. Some commissioned statues depicting them with unnaturally smooth faces and powerful physiques, desperate to control the perception of vitality. But such images only deepened the performance, layering illusion upon illusion. In the long term, these pressures created cycles of paranoia and brutality. A ruler who trusted no one often lashed out, executing or exiling courtiers on the slightest suspicion. Those who survived grew more cautious, more servile, more deceptive, feeding the king only what he wanted to hear, never the truth. Over time, this could blind the pharaoh to the realities of his own kingdom, leaving him both supreme in authority and fatally ignorant. Yet the paradox remains. It was precisely this web of surveillance and manipulation that sustained the monarchy. Without the court's machinery, the scribes, priests, generals, and viziers, the pharaoh's godlike image would collapse. The very men who spied on him, flattered him, and schemed against him were the same men who made his rule possible. The king was both master of the court and its captive, a god enthroned and a prisoner gilded in gold. And so life at court was not the glittering paradise we often imagine. It was a world of masks, whispers, and endless performance. A world where even the mightiest man in Egypt could never be fully himself. The price of divine kingship was a lifetime of suspicion and the slow erosion of trust until the pharaoh stood alone on a throne, surrounded by countless faces and yet utterly isolated. When people imagine ancient Egypt, they often picture dazzling treasures, gleaming gold masks, jeweled necklaces, vast temples lined with statues and tombs overflowing with riches. These images are not false. The Egyptian elite lived surrounded by splendor that astonishes the modern eye. But behind this brilliance was a darker reality. Wealth itself became a trap, a gilded cage that distorted values, fueled envy, and burdened the pharaoh with expectations no mortal could truly bear. Gold was the lifeblood of royal prestige. Egypt's mines in Nubia supplied streams of precious metal that no other ancient kingdom could rival. Pharaohs flaunted it in temples, covering shrines and obelisks with golden plates that reflected the desert sun. Royal tombs were filled with golden masks, couches, and chariots. Even everyday objects for the wealthy cups, combs, sandals were fashioned from gold and precious stones. In a culture where the gods themselves were thought to possess golden flesh, the use of this metal tied rulers directly to the divine. But the hunger for such splendor was insatiable. Each pharaoh felt compelled to outshine his predecessor, to build a temple larger to sponsor festivals, more lavish to leave behind tombs, more magnificent. This competition drove massive labor demands, extracting endless toil from farmers, craftsmen, and slaves. For the king, it meant constant pressure. If his reign failed to produce visible monumental wealth, he risked being remembered as weak or cursed. The curse of wealth was not only in its pursuit, but in its consequences. Within the palace, riches created divides sharper than swords. Courtiers fought viciously for golden collars of honor, estates, and luxurious goods. The possession of rare jewelry or imported ivory could elevate a man overnight, while losing favor could strip him of everything. This instability bred resentment and constant competition, deepening the atmosphere of paranoia. For the pharaoh himself, splendor became suffocating. His attire was not a matter of choice, but of expectation. Gold sandals, elaborate collars, heavy crowns, symbols of divinity that were also physical burdens. On ceremonial days, the ruler's regalia could weigh dozens of pounds, turning a living man into a glittering statue. Every appearance required staging costume and performance. Even rest became a ritual, beds inlaid with ivory headrests of polished stone perfumes that masked the natural body. Comfort was sacrificed for display, and yet wealth failed to provide safety. The more riches accumulated in palaces and tombs, the more they attracted thieves. Even in antiquity, royal tombs were frequently looted, sometimes within decades of a burial. Entire gangs of robbers, often insiders, like tomb workers and priests, tunneled into chambers, stripping corpses of their gold amulets and tearing apart sacred wrappings. This meant that the splendor of death often turned into humiliation. The pharaoh's carefully prepared afterlife scattered by greedy hands. The tragic irony was clear. The wealth meant to glorify kingship often undermined it. In life, it demanded endless labor, paranoia, and performance. In death, it invited violation and desecration. The glitter of gold concealed a darker reality. The splendor that made Egypt's rulers seem godlike was also a curse that weighed on them until the very end. If wealth defined the image of Egyptian kingship in stone and gold, it also seeped into daily life in subtler, more corrosive ways. The royal household was not merely comfortable, it was a theater of excess. Food, clothing, perfumes, and entertainments were not chosen for pleasure alone, but performed as proof of divinity. Yet the very abundance that surrounded the pharaoh also sowed discomfort, illness, and the erosion of simple human joys. The royal table groaned under endless delicacies. Bread and beer formed the foundation of Egyptian diet, but for the court meals were lavish feasts featuring roasted goose, beef, gazelle, and fish from the Nile. Honey dates and figs sweetened desserts, while imported spices and wines from the Levant elevated flavors. Banquets were held with such regularity that overeating became a mark of status. To eat modestly was to appear poor. To indulge was to proclaim wealth. But such indulgence carried its toll. Mummy studies of elite individuals have revealed clogged arteries, dental decay, and obesity ailments uncommon among ordinary farmers. The pharaoh himself, confined to ritual appearances and endless ceremonies, often lived less actively than his subjects. His body, encased in gold and pampered with luxuries, frequently betrayed the consequences of excess. To many rulers, the price of opulence was ill health and an early decline. Clothing, too, reflected this burden of splendor. Where commoners wore simple linen kilts, the pharaoh's garments were elaborate, layered, and decorated with beads, gems, and gold threads. Sandals were sometimes inlaid with precious stones, too delicate for practical use. The sheer weight of ceremonial clothing made long appearances exhausting, but to appear in simpler attire would risk scandal. Even his perfumes, crafted from imported resins and rare oils, had to be overwhelming, projecting not just hygiene, but godlike radiance. Entertainment within the palace mirrored this same pattern of excess. Musicians, dancers, acrobats, and poets filled the royal halls, their performances carefully staged to amuse the ruler. Hunting expeditions became grand spectacles rather than simple pastimes, with hundreds of retainers accompanying the pharaoh to chase animals across controlled reserves. The king's leisure was never free, but always choreographed another performance for courtiers to witness. Yet the darker edge of such wealth was its insatiability. The more the pharaoh indulged, the more courtiers expected it. Festivals had to be bigger feasts, longer, and gifts richer. A ruler who appeared restrained risked whispers of miserliness or weakness. Thus, extravagance became not a choice, but an obligation, one that consumed resources and deepened inequality across the kingdom. For the pharaoh, this created a paradoxical imprisonment. Though surrounded by unimaginable luxury, he was denied the freedom to live simply. He could not walk barefoot without scandal. He could not eat humbly without appearing diminished. Even moments of rest, drinking wine, reclining in gardens, were carefully staged, observed, and remembered. Excess, which should have been pleasure, became performance. In this sense, the splendor of royal life was both intoxicating and corrosive. It filled palaces with dazzling beauty, yet it hollowed out the possibility of sincerity. The pharaoh's days were drenched in gold and perfume, yet beneath the surface lay discomfort, illness, and the gnawing realization that the kingdom demanded not a man, but an eternal spectacle. Nowhere was the curse of wealth more evident than in death. For the pharaoh, life was only the first act. The afterlife was the stage where splendor had to be eternal. Burial was not simply a religious duty, it was the ultimate demonstration of power, a final performance meant to secure both divine favor and the memory of greatness. Yet this obsession with wealth in death carried with it profound irony. The more lavish the tomb, the greater the danger it faced. Royal burials were extraordinary undertakings. From the old kingdom's pyramids to the new kingdom's hidden tombs in the Valley of the Kings, monumental architecture proclaimed the divine status of rulers. Walls were covered in intricate scenes of gods, stars, and sacred journeys, all painted to guide the pharaoh's soul. Coffins were layered, sometimes 3 or 4 deep, each plated with gold inlaid with lapis lazuli and inscribed with spells from the Book of the Dead. Jewelry, amulets, weapons, and statues were buried alongside the body, intended to protect and empower the king in eternity. The sheer scale of these preparations drained resources from the living. Farmers, artisans, and soldiers were mobilized to construct tombs, carve stone, and craft treasures, sometimes for decades. A ruler's death was prepared for almost from the moment he ascended the throne. Wealth was funneled into this vast machine of funerary splendor, often while ordinary Egyptians lived on meager bread and onions. In many ways, the pharaoh's afterlife came at the expense of his people's present. Yet the tragedy was that this investment rarely lasted. Tomb robbery was as old as the tombs themselves. The lure of gold buried underground proved irresistible even to those charged with guarding it. Bands of thieves, sometimes former workers who had helped build the tombs, crept into chambers, prying open sarcophagi, hacking apart mummies to strip off jewelry and carrying away treasures. Inscriptions from the New Kingdom reveal shocking details, thieves confessing to burning linen wrappings for easier access to amulets or melting down golden masks for profit. Even priests entrusted with maintaining the sanctity of the dead often colluded in these crimes. Economic pressures, famine, or political collapse turned tombs into treasuries waiting to be plundered. Ironically, the very splendor designed to protect the pharaoh in the afterlife instead painted a target on his eternal resting place. This left rulers in a cruel bind. To be buried without wealth was unthinkable. It would mean poverty in the afterlife, a humiliation for the divine king. But to be buried with wealth was to invite desecration. Some later rulers, aware of this cycle, attempted secrecy, hiding tombs deep in cliffs or burying themselves in less conspicuous chambers. Yet even these measures failed, and few pharaohs truly escaped the hands of looters. The ultimate irony lies in how history remembers them. Tutankhamun, a relatively minor king, is famous today not for his reign, but because his tomb by accident or luck remained mostly intact until the 20th century. His golden mask, untouched for millennia, dazzled the world and revived fascination with Egypt. Meanwhile, far greater pharaohs who commanded empires and built colossal monuments were reduced to broken mummies, stripped of their treasures, their names forgotten. In death as in life, the wealth of the pharaoh was both his power and his curse. It demanded immense sacrifice, invited betrayal, and too often left only ruins where eternal glory was meant to stand. Gold could not shield him from decay or theft. The kings of Egypt sought immortality through splendor, but time proved merciless, reminding us that no treasure, however dazzling, could guarantee eternity. If royal wealth glittered with divine promise, it also cast long shadows across Egypt's society. The splendor of the pharaoh's court was not conjured from thin air. It was extracted grain by grain and stone by stone from the labor of millions. For common Egyptians, the magnificence of palaces and tombs often meant hardship in daily life. The state demanded tribute from every province. Grain, livestock, and labor were collected to support the royal household and its endless appetite for luxury. Farmers toiled under the desert sun, knowing that much of their harvest would never feed their families, but instead be stored in temple granaries or consumed at court banquets. Stonecutters and masons carved monuments for decades, sometimes never living to see them finished. To glorify the king's eternity, countless ordinary lives were worn down by exhausting work. This imbalance created an unspoken resentment. Though Egyptian culture emphasized loyalty to the divine ruler, inscriptions and papyri occasionally reveal discontent. In the Admonitions of Ipuwer, a text reflecting times of turmoil, we glimpse a society turned upside down, the poor envying the rich, the hungry raging against those with full bellies. Wealth concentrated in palaces and temples left the social fabric brittle. The extravagance of pharaohs also distorted politics. Court officials competed for proximity to the king, knowing that access meant gold and power. Corruption spread through networks of patronage. Bribes disguised as gifts flowed to secure favors. A system meant to serve the gods began to serve itself, with wealth both the lubricant and the poison of governance. Even religion, once a source of unity, bent under the weight of luxury. Temples were not merely sacred spaces, they became massive economic engines, owning farmland, livestock, and workshops. Priests grew wealthy, sometimes rivaling the authority of the pharaoh. Ordinary worshippers who offered modest sacrifices of bread or beer could see with their own eyes the stark contrast between their piety and the opulence of golden altars. Spiritual devotion became entangled with social inequality. For the pharaoh, this widening gulf was dangerous. A ruler who lived too richly risked appearing out of touch with his people's struggles. During times of famine or foreign invasion, lavish displays of gold could feel like mockery to the starving. Dynasties crumbled not only from military defeat, but from internal collapse, fueled in part by resentment at the endless drain of resources toward royal splendor. The late New Kingdom provides a sobering case. As Egypt faced economic strain, tomb robbery, and corruption surged. Even workers at Deir el-Medina, who carved the royal tombs, went on strike, the first recorded strike in history, because they had not received their grain rations. This was a stunning moment. The very hands that built the Pharaoh's eternal resting place withheld their labor, revealing how fragile the bond between ruler and people could become when wealth was hoarded at the top. Over centuries, this pattern repeated. Luxurious courts, bloated temples, and extravagant burials drained the treasury. Foreign enemies, sensing weakness, struck. Internal revolts flared, and always beneath the glitter of gold lay the same truth that excess carried within it the seeds of ruin. Thus, the curse of wealth was not limited to the pharaoh himself. It spread outward, infecting the court, distorting religion, and straining the bond between king and subjects. Splendor dazzled, but it also blinded rulers to the needs of their people, blinded courtiers to loyalty, and blinded society to the dangers of imbalance. In the end, Egypt's wealth became both its marvel and its downfall. The monuments still stand immense and awe-inspiring, but behind them echo the voices of countless lives, sacrificed to sustain a brilliance that could never last. The pharaoh's gold gleamed in the sun, but beneath it, the empire's foundations cracked. When we imagine pharaohs, we picture men, stern-jawed rulers in crowns of gold, their muscular forms carved into the walls of temples. But Egypt, with its paradoxes and complexities, produced a story that defied this mold. In the 15th century BCE, a woman named Hatshepsut rose above expectation and became not queen, not consort, but king of Pharaoh in her own right. Her reign flourished with stability and wealth. Yet after her death, her legacy was almost obliterated. Statues shattered, inscriptions gouged out her name, scraped away as though she had never lived. It was one of history's most audacious acts of erasure. To understand the shock of Hatshepsut's rise, we must first see the world she inherited. The throne of Egypt was a divine seat embodying the god Horus on earth. Tradition demanded male succession. Women held influence as queens, mothers, and priestesses, but never as the sovereign ruler. Even powerful queen consorts like Nefertari or Ahmose Nefertari were revered through their connection to a male pharaoh. A woman stepping into the throne itself was almost unthinkable. Yet when her husband Thutmose II died young, Hatshepsut acted decisively. The throne technically belonged to the child Thutmose III, her stepson still too young to rule. As queen regent, she could have governed quietly until the boy matured. Instead, she reimagined her position. Within a few years, she declared herself pharaoh, not queen regent, but king. She donned the regalia, the kilt, the false beard, the Nemes headdress. On temple walls, artists depicted her with masculine musculature, sometimes even bare chest like a male sovereign. The inscriptions used masculine pronouns, His Majesty the King of Upper and Lower Egypt. Egypt had never seen anything like it. Why did she make this leap, scholars debate. Some argue it was pure necessity. A stable ruler was needed to secure Egypt's borders and economy, and a mere regency seemed too fragile. Others suggest ambition. Hatshepsut may have seized the chance to crown herself determined to wield power directly rather than stand behind a boy king. Whatever the motive, she ruled not as a caretaker, but as a monarch. Her reign proved remarkably successful. She consolidated trade, re-established routes to Punt, a fabled land of incense and gold, and oversaw monumental building projects. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari still stands as one of Egypt's architectural wonders, its terraces rising against the cliffs in elegant harmony. In art and inscription, she emphasized divine sanction, claiming that the god Amun himself had fathered her a divine birth that justified her unprecedented kingship. But beneath the glory lay tension. Thutmose III, growing older, must have known that the throne was his by right, yet his stepmother's hand remained firm on the reins of power. Courtiers and priests, while outwardly loyal, navigated an uneasy balance between acknowledging a female pharaoh and anticipating the eventual rule of the rightful heir. For 2 decades, this arrangement held. Egypt prospered under her stability, but the unusual situation created cracks beneath the surface. When Hatshepsut died, the tide turned. Thutmose III, now an experienced general and adult monarch, assumed full control. At first, there was no open rupture. He allowed her burial in the Valley of the Kings, and records show no violent coup. Yet years later, an extraordinary campaign began. Her statues were smashed, her images chiseled away, her cartouches erased. Where once she stood proudly in relief, now there was only empty stone or crude plaster. This was more than politics. It was an attempt to rewrite history. By stripping her name and image, her successors sought to deny her existence as king, to fold her reign back into obscurity as though it had never happened. For centuries, Hatshepsut was nearly forgotten. Only fragments of statues buried in pits, only faint outlines on temple walls hinted that a woman had once worn the double crown. The audacity of this erasure raises questions. Was it Thutmose III's vengeance, delayed but decisive? Was it priestly hostility, a rejection of a female king as an affront to Ma'at, the cosmic order? Or was it political convenience, a way to tidy up the dynastic record by presenting an unbroken line of male succession? Perhaps it was all three. What is certain is this Hatshepsut story reveals both the brilliance and the brutality of Egyptian kingship. She proved that a woman could rule Egypt as successfully as any man. Yet the system could not tolerate her memory, as though her very existence threatened the foundation of divine monarchy. To preserve the myth of eternal male pharaohs, her legacy was shattered, her glory drowned in silence. Today, archaeologists have painstakingly pieced her back together. Fragments of shattered statues reassembled in museum halls revealed the strong features of a ruler once denied. The temple of Deir el-Bahari still whispers her name across the cliffs of Thebes. Against the will of those who tried to erase her, Hatshepsut endures not as a forgotten shadow, but as one of Egypt's most extraordinary rulers. The palace of Thebes in the time of Hatshepsut was both dazzling and dangerous. Behind the polished limestone columns, the scent of lotus oil and the gilded shrines to Amun, there pulsed a web of power, intrigue, and whispered resentment. To rule Egypt was never merely a matter of donning a crown. It was to step into a nest of rivalries where generals, priests, scribes, and kin each pulled at the fabric of power. For a woman, the dangers multiplied. Hatshepsut's ascent to the throne challenged centuries of tradition, and though official inscriptions proclaimed her divinely chosen, the reality was more precarious. She surrounded herself with loyal courtiers, men whose careers flourished under her reign. Chief among them was Senenmut, a courtier of humble origins who rose to dazzling prominence. He oversaw her grand building projects, including the magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, and held more than 20 titles, steward of the king tutor to the princess Neferure and overseer of royal works. Senenmut's closeness to the queen-turned-king sparked endless speculation, both ancient and modern. Was he her lover, a secret partner behind the throne, or simply a brilliant administrator whose loyalty she could trust in a court filled with potential enemies? No papyrus confesses the truth, yet his unprecedented privileges suggest a bond deeper than mere service. His tomb even carried hidden inscriptions of Hatshepsut's name, a devotion bordering on personal, perhaps even romantic. But such favoritism had its dangers. Other nobles must have chafed at the meteoric rise of a commoner, while their own ambitions were sidelined. In the rigid hierarchy of Egyptian society, Senenmut's prominence was both shocking and threatening. The court, already uneasy with a female pharaoh, now saw her championed by a man of no royal blood. Whispers must have curled through the corridors of Karnak, and the temple halls of Luxor was the divine balance of Ma'at being strained. Meanwhile, Thutmose III, the boy king sidelined by his stepmother, was growing into a formidable man. While Hatshepsut governed, Thutmose was not idle. He trained in the military arts, honing his skills as a warrior and commander. Records suggest that he spent much of his youth leading campaigns and commanding armies, experiences that would later define his reign as one of Egypt's most martial kings. If Hatshepsut embodied stability and prosperity, Thutmose would come to embody conquest and expansion. The coexistence of these two rulers was a delicate dance. On temple walls, their images sometimes appeared side by side as though sharing rule. Yet subtle details reveal the truth. Hatshepsut was always depicted in the dominant position, her cartouches larger, her figure placed before the boys. For courtiers reading between the lines, the message was clear. Egypt had one true ruler, and it was not the son of Thutmose II. What must Thutmose have felt watching year after year as his stepmother held the throne? Did he simmer with resentment, or did he bide his time with cold calculation? Ancient records offer no diary, no confession, but the fact that he did not act against her during her lifetime suggests either restraint or necessity. Perhaps the support she commanded, bolstered by her ties to the powerful priesthood of Amun, was simply too strong to challenge him. And here lies another key religion. Hatshepsut's reign was anchored not only in political maneuvering, but in divine legitimacy. She promoted herself as the daughter of Amun, the chief deity of Thebes. Reliefs at Deir el-Bahari depict the god visiting her mother, impregnating her with divine seed. By this narrative, Hatshepsut was not merely a human ruler, but a god's offspring. To oppose her would have been sacrilege. Still, such claims could not silence all unease. The priesthood of Amun was immensely powerful, controlling vast lands, wealth, and political influence. While they outwardly supported her, the alignment may have been one of convenience. Hatshepsut lavished resources on their temples, elevating their prestige. But once her rule ended, would the priests stand firmly by her memory, or would they side with the more conventional narrative of male succession? History seems to suggest the latter. As the years passed, Thutmose grew older, more experienced, and more patient. By the time of Hatshepsut's death, after more than 2 decades of rule, he was no longer a sidelined boy, but a seasoned warrior in his 30s. The stage was set for a transition that would reveal the fragility of her legacy. At first, Thutmose acted with restraint. He buried Hatshepsut with royal honors in the Valley of the Kings, placing her in a tomb prepared for her earlier, as queen later expanded to reflect her status as king. For a time, her name still appeared alongside his in official records. This restraint has puzzled historians. If Thutmose despised her, why not strike her name immediately? The answer may lie in the gradual nature of what followed. Only years later, some scholars estimate 20 years into his reign, did the systematic erasure of Hatshepsut begin. This was no impulsive act of vengeance. It was deliberate, organized, and targeted. Her statues were pulled down from temples and smashed, their fragments buried in pits. Her images on reliefs were chiseled out, sometimes replaced with those of Thutmose himself. Even her cartouches, the sacred ovals enclosing her royal name, were scraped away from monuments. The purpose was clear: to rewrite the record so that Egypt's kingship appeared unbroken and male. The reign of a female pharaoh was a dangerous precedent, one that could inspire future queens to challenge the throne. Better to erase her memory entirely, to restore the cosmic order of Ma'at through the chisel and hammer of revision. In this campaign, we glimpse both the brilliance and the brutality of Egyptian politics. For all its majesty and divinity, the throne was never immune to insecurity. Even the greatest monuments could be undone by successors determined to shape memory itself. Yet despite this erasure, fragments survived. Statues buried rather than destroyed, faint outlines where chisels faltered, inscriptions hidden in less visible corners, all preserved echoes of her reign. And centuries later, when archaeologists uncovered these remnants, the silenced voice of Hatshepsut spoke again, rising from the dust to reclaim her place among Egypt's kings. The erasure of Hatshepsut was not a hasty vandalism. It was a calculated campaign of memory warfare. To the ancient Egyptians, names were more than words. They were lifelines to eternity. To speak or carve the name of a person was to ensure their spirit lived on. To erase a name was not simply to dishonor, it was to condemn the soul to oblivion. When the order came, most likely during the later years of Thutmose III's reign, stonecutters set to work across Egypt. At Karnak, statues of Hatshepsut were toppled and buried in pits broken into fragments, but not completely pulverized. At Deir el-Bahari, her crowning jewel of architecture, teams climbed scaffolds to chip away her face, her cartouches, and her regal figure from the temple walls. In some scenes, her image was replaced with that of Thutmose, so that his rule appeared to flow seamlessly from his father to himself, uninterrupted by the woman who had ruled for 2 decades. The work was thorough, yet strangely inconsistent. Some monuments were defaced entirely, while others were left intact. Some cartouches were chiseled away with precision. Others were left faintly visible, as though the artisans lacked zeal or were unwilling to erase fully. This patchwork quality has led scholars to debate the true motivation. Was this Thutmose's personal vendetta a son's anger against a stepmother who had usurped his throne? Or was it political theatre, a calculated effort to prevent future women from citing her as precedent? Many Egyptologists favor the latter. Thutmose III was no reckless avenger. He was one of Egypt's greatest statesmen and generals. By the time he ordered the erasures, he had already established himself as a powerful pharaoh in his own right. His empire stretched from Nubia to the Levant, secured by brilliant military campaigns. He did not need to prove his strength against a ghost. Instead, his actions appear to have been an ideological purification, a way of rewriting history to restore the appearance of male succession. The religious dimension was equally important. The ideology of kingship was built upon Ma'at, the divine balance of order. A female king was an anomaly that unsettled this cosmic harmony. By chiseling her away, the priests and artisans were not just erasing a ruler, they were restoring cosmic order as they understood it. To them, this was not destruction, but correction. Archaeological evidence of this campaign is striking. In the 20th century, excavations at Karnak uncovered pits filled with shattered statues of Hatshepsut. Heads lay severed from torsos, arms, broken hieroglyphs gouged out. And yet these statues were buried carefully, not discarded as rubble. It is as if the erasers feared the divine power still embedded in her image and sought to conceal it respectfully rather than risk open desecration. Even more haunting are the half-erased reliefs at Deir el-Bahari. Walk the temple today and you will see outlines of her figure faintly etched into stone, the chisel marks still visible from where artisans struggled to obliterate her presence. In some scenes, her erased silhouette stands like a ghost beside intact figures, a reminder of both her power and her erasure. And yet the attempt to silence her was never complete. Names survived in hidden corners, statues buried but not destroyed, inscriptions in less visible shrines overlooked by the hammer. Hatshepsut's mummy itself, though debated, may have survived. Many believe it is the unadorned female body discovered in KV60, identified by dental and DNA analysis in 2007 as likely hers. If true, she escaped the ultimate fate of annihilation, preserved against the will of those who tried to erase her. Ironically, it was this very campaign of destruction that preserved her memory for us today. Had her monument stood intact, she might have blended into the long line of pharaohs, her story another chapter in Egypt's sprawling history. But the violence of her erasure left scars, chisel marks, broken statues, altered reliefs that drew the attention of modern archaeologists. In seeking to erase her, Thutmose III ensured that future generations would notice her absence, and in asking why was she erased, they rediscovered her. Her story thus became a resurrection, From the Valley of the Kings to the grand halls of museums in Cairo, New York, and London, her shattered statues have been reassembled. Her inscriptions, faint but legible, have been translated. Today, historians hail her as one of the most successful pharaohs of the New Kingdom, a ruler who brought wealth, stability, and grandeur to Egypt. And so, though her enemies sought to silence her voice, Hatshepsut speaks again. In the museum glass cases in the walls of Deir el-Bahari and in the academic debates that still swirl around her, she defies the ancient damnatio memoriae. The chisel could not erase eternity. The irony of Hatshepsut's story is that her erasure amplified her legacy. The Egyptians of her time may have believed they could silence her name, but centuries later, it was precisely those chisel marks, those scars in the stone, that caught the eyes of archaeologists and scholars. They whispered of a ruler who had been deemed dangerous even in memory, a ruler powerful enough to merit obliteration. When 19th century explorers began clearing the sands from Deir el-Bahari, they stood before towering columns and sweeping terraces carved into the cliffs. At first they believed this magnificent complex belonged to Thutmose III, for his name was prominent where hers had been erased. But as careful hands brushed away dust and sunlight, struck faded hieroglyphs, faint outlines of another name appeared, Matkare Hatshepsut. Slowly, the truth emerged. This temple was not a man's monument, it was hers. The discovery challenged long-held assumptions about ancient Egypt. For generations, scholars had pictured the civilization as rigidly patriarchal, with women relegated to supporting roles. Here, however, was proof of a woman who had wielded absolute authority, ruled for 2 decades, and presided over one of the most prosperous eras of the New Kingdom. The silence of history cracked open, and her voice, suppressed for 3,000 years, began to speak again. Her statues, once smashed, were painstakingly reconstructed in museums across the world. In Cairo's Egyptian Museum, her elegant limestone bust gazes serenely ahead, her lips curved in a faint smile. In New York's Metropolitan Museum, fragments of her kneeling statues, hands extended in offering, remind visitors of a pharaoh who commanded reverence. Each piece tells not just of artistic mastery, but of the violence of erasure and the triumph of survival. Yet the questions linger. Was Thutmose III truly the architect of her erasure, or did his successors complete the task long after his death? Was her memory targeted because she was a woman, or because her reign represented an ideological threat to the order of kingship? The debates continue, but in one sense, the answers matter less than the result. Her story has become a parable of power, gender, and historical memory. In modern times, Hatshepsut has been reimagined as more than a pharaoh. She is an icon. To feminists, she embodies the struggle of women whose achievements are minimized or erased in patriarchal systems. To historians, she represents the fragility of historical truth, the ease with which records can be rewritten by the victors. To visitors at Deir el-Bahari, she is a ghostly presence, her image both absent and present, erased and eternal. Her life also reminds us that power once seized comes at a cost. To maintain her rule, she cloaked herself in male iconography, donning the beard and headdress of kingship. She manipulated tradition to justify her reign, proclaiming herself chosen by the gods. She succeeded magnificently, but her very success provoked fear in those who followed. The dynasty could not afford to let her stand as precedent. In erasing her, they sought to secure the future. And yet the future proved otherwise. Hatshepsut endures. She is studied in classrooms, celebrated in documentaries, and immortalized in art. She appears not as a footnote, but as one of the towering figures of Egyptian history. Her reign is remembered for stability, prosperity, and innovation. Ironically, qualities that her erasure could never obscure. To stand today at Deir el-Bahari is to feel her paradox. The temple rising in white terraces against the red cliffs proclaims her glory even in its scars. The erasures are visible blank spaces where her face once was hollow outlines, where her cartouches were cut away. But the absence itself is presence. It testifies to her power, for only someone truly formidable could inspire such an effort to wipe her away. In the end, Hatshepsut teaches us a lesson about memory itself. Names can be struck from stone faces, can be defaced, but history has a way of preserving what is most powerful. Her enemies believed they consigned her to oblivion. Instead, they ensured she would be remembered not merely as a ruler, but as a symbol of resilience, of forgotten voices, recovered of the eternal struggle between those who wield power and those who write history. The chisel may cut stone, but it cannot cut eternity. To the ancient Egyptians, kingship was not simply a political office. It was a divine inheritance. Pharaoh was not merely the ruler of men, he was the bridge between the mortal and the eternal, the human and the divine. His blood was thought to carry the essence of the gods, flowing like a sacred river through generations. To dilute that blood with outsiders, even nobles, was to risk weakening the very fabric of cosmic order. This belief shaped marriage practices in ways that shocked later cultures. In the palaces of Thebes and Memphis, siblings did not merely sit beside one another at royal feasts, they often stood as husband and wife. Brother married sister, sometimes even father married daughter, in unions designed not to shock but to sanctify. What outsiders might condemn as taboo, Egyptians enshrined as holy. At the heart of this practice was myth. The gods themselves had set the precedent. Osiris and Isis were brother and sister, yet also husband and wife, and their sacred union gave birth to Horus, the god who embodied kingship itself. If the divine family intermarried, why should the royal family not do the same? Pharaoh, after all, was Horus incarnate, the living god on earth. To replicate divine unions was not scandal, it was imitation of the eternal. Inscriptions and reliefs present these marriages not with secrecy, but with grandeur. Pharaohs and their queens, sometimes sisters, sometimes half-sisters, stand hand in hand, receiving the blessing of Amun or Ra. Their children are depicted as radiant heirs, proof of continuity, embodiments of the sacred bloodline. The logic was clear: to preserve purity, one must marry within. But beneath the divine justifications lay political necessity. Egypt was a land of great wealth and dangerous ambition. Royal marriages to commoners, even noble families, risked empowering rival factions. By keeping marriage within the royal house, pharaohs ensured that power remained tightly contained. sister queens were not merely spouses, they were shields against political fracture. A throne shared between brother and sister was less likely to be contested by outside claimants. Yet the practice carried consequences. To modern eyes, the price is obvious. Generations of intermarriage weakened the gene pool, creating fragile heirs plagued by deformities and disease. The mummies of royal children bear witness: club foot, scoliosis, cleft palate. Scholars analyzing the remains of Tutankhamun, for instance, found evidence of congenital weakness, results of centuries of intermarriage within the 18th dynasty. What the Egyptians saw as holy blood nature punished with frailty. Still within their worldview, the risks were worth the reward. Pharaohs believed that their survival as gods on earth depended on purity of blood. To them, a child with divine lineage, however fragile in body, was infinitely more legitimate than a robust child born of an outsider. In this balance of faith and biology, the gods always weighed heavier than science. This obsession with blood and divinity reached its most dramatic expression, not in the early dynasties, but in the late era under the Ptolemies. Descendants of Alexander the Great, these Macedonian rulers adopted Egyptian customs to legitimize themselves, embracing sibling marriage with a zeal that rivaled even the ancient myths. Cleopatra Crescent. The last pharaoh of Egypt was herself a product of this tradition, a queen whose bloodline was the tightly interwoven web of brother-sister unions. And so across centuries, the same paradox repeated. Egypt's rulers believed they safeguarded eternity through sacred unions, but in reality they sowed seeds of weakness in their own flesh. The dynasty's strength, paradoxically, was also its fragility. When we step deeper into the annals of Egyptian royalty, the divine logic of incestuous unions takes on flesh and blood. Names etched in stone tell stories not merely of reigns and wars, but of marriages that would have scandalized the rest of the ancient world. For Egypt, however, these unions were not whispers of shame, they were proclamations of godhood. Take Akhenaten, the heretic king of the 18th dynasty. He is remembered for defying tradition, elevating the sun disk Aten above all gods and moving the capital to Amarna. Yet his most radical act was not only religious, it was marital. In the frescoes and carvings of Amarna, Akhenaten appears beside his queen Nefertiti in tender intimacy, an unusual display for Egyptian art. But behind the scenes, whispers suggest an even stranger bond. Akhenaten may have taken one of his own daughters as consort. The evidence lies in reliefs showing Akhenaten with daughters elevated to divine status, their images presented as near equals. Scholars debate whether the youngest Ankhesenaten, later wife of Tutankhamun, was once groomed as his consort. If true, it reflects the king's obsession with divinity above convention, his family itself becoming a living pantheon where boundaries of kinship dissolved in the name of godhood. Then comes Tutankhamun, Akhenaten's son, whose tomb discovery in 1922 electrified the world. For all the treasures it held, his body told a darker tale. DNA studies revealed that Tutankhamun was the product of sibling marriage, his father Akhenaten and mother, a sister wife. The result was catastrophic. Tut was frail with a cleft palate, scoliosis, and a club foot that forced him to walk with a cane. His early death around the age of 19 may have been hastened by malaria, but his genetic fragility made him especially vulnerable. In Tutankhamun, the ideology of blood purity met its tragic biological limit. A boy king hailed as the living Horus was in truth a fragile child burdened by the weight of divine expectations and the defects of his ancestry. His golden mask proclaimed perfection, but his bones whispered a different truth. Centuries later, the practice was revived with renewed intensity under the Ptolemies. These rulers, descendants of Macedonian generals who seized Egypt after Alexander the Great, were foreigners desperate for legitimacy. To Egyptians, they were outsiders. Greeks who spoke another tongue, worshipped strange gods, and ruled from Alexandria. Yet by adopting Egyptian traditions, they sought to become pharaohs in every sense. Chief among these traditions was sibling marriage. Ptolemaic kings married their sisters with almost ritualistic regularity, a practice shocking to their Greek contemporaries but essential in Egyptian eyes. By uniting brother and sister, they wrapped themselves in the mantle of Isis and Osiris, presenting themselves not as foreign rulers, but as the reborn divine family. The most famous of them all, Cleopatra, second and last queen of Egypt, was herself the child of such unions. Though history remembers her for her liaisons with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, her early life was shaped by the claustrophobic web of sibling marriages. She co-ruled with her brother husbands, first Ptolemy XIII and later Ptolemy XIV, both younger brothers who were also consorts. The throne of Egypt in her time was not merely a seat of power, it was a marriage bed entangled with politics and divinity. What did this mean for those born into such a system? For some it meant early death and frailty. For others it meant wielding immense power in bodies weakened by generations of interbreeding. For all it meant no escape. Pharaohs were trapped by the very ideology that exalted them. To marry outside was unthinkable. To marry within was a divine duty. And so the cycle continued, bloodline tightening generation after generation. From Akhenaten's rumored daughter-wife, to Tutankhamun's broken body, to Cleopatra's dynastic entanglements, the story of incest in Egyptian royalty is not one of scandal, but of survival. It was the price of being gods on earth. Yet behind every gilded throne and sacred marriage contract, one must imagine the human cost. Did sisters coerced into these unions feel devotion or despair? Did fragile children hailed as living gods sense the weight of their frailty? These questions cannot be answered by stone inscriptions or golden masks. They linger in the silence of tombs, in the twisted bones of mummies, in the spaces where divinity demanded more than humanity could give. The grandeur of Egypt's royal ideology shimmers in gold masks, towering statues, and lavish tombs. But beneath the glitter, the bones of its rulers tell a grimmer story. Thanks to modern science, especially genetic testing and forensic anthropology, we can now glimpse the hidden toll that centuries of inbreeding inflicted upon the very bodies of those hailed as gods on earth. When Howard Carter uncovered Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, the world was dazzled. Here was the boy king buried in an avalanche of riches, chariots, jewelry, gilded shrines, the iconic golden mask. For decades, his early death at 19 remained a mystery. Speculations abounded. Was he murdered by court rivals? Did a blow to the head kill him? Or did he fall from a chariot in battle? It was not until the 21st century with CT scans and DNA testing that truth emerged. Tutankhamun was not murdered, he was undone by his own bloodline. Studies revealed severe congenital defects, a cleft palate scoliosis, twisting his spine, and a clubfoot that forced him to walk with canes, several of which were found in his tomb. He was riddled with weakness, a fragile vessel for the divine spirit he was meant to embody. DNA results confirmed the suspicion Tut was the son of a brother-sister union. His father was Akhenaten, and his mother was not Nefertiti as once assumed, but one of Akhenaten's sisters. This meant Tutankhamun's genetic diversity was alarmingly narrow, a recipe for disaster. The frailty of his body was the physical manifestation of Egypt's obsession with purity, and Tutankhamun was not alone. Other royal mummies, when examined, show similar patterns of deformity and ill health. Some pharaohs and queens appear to have suffered from elongated skulls, club feet, or dental deformities, all potential symptoms of inbreeding. While Egyptian art portrayed the pharaohs as strong, godlike, and eternal, the truth was that many of them limped through life in pain. The irony is striking. The very effort to embody divine perfection produced rulers who were physically broken. They were draped in gold and linen, worshipped as Horus incarnate, yet inside their bones were brittle, their bodies racked with disease. The Ptolemaic dynasty amplified this problem. By the time of Cleopatra's seventh sibling marriage was not just tradition, but policy. Each generation married within the family to secure legitimacy. Over time, the genetic pool shrank dangerously. Ancient writers hint at madness and instability among later Ptolemies, though evidence is fragmentary. Still, the pattern fits insularity, breeding fragility both of mind and body. Modern science has peeled back the glamour to reveal a paradox. The golden mask of Tutankhamun, symbol of eternal youth and beauty, hides a face that in life was plagued by suffering. The shrines and hymns declaring the pharaoh a living god conceal a truth: he was as vulnerable as any man, perhaps more so. His divinity was written in stone, but his humanity was written in his DNA. What then did these rulers feel in private moments? Did Tutankhamun, struggling to walk, sense the cruel irony of being hailed as a warrior king? Did Cleopatra's brothers, married off as consorts, feel the claustrophobia of destiny written in blood? Did queens forced to wed their own kin feel trapped between duty to gods and revulsion at kinship? These questions haunt the story of incest in Egypt. They remind us that ideology has consequences, not just in temples and politics, but in flesh and bone. The pharaohs paid for their divinity with their bodies, and yet their suffering was not meaningless in their own worldview. Each deformity, each frailty could be seen as part of their divine burden. To live as a god on earth was to endure more than mortal men. If weakness was the price, it was a price paid for eternity. Still, from our modern vantage point, the verdict is harsh. Incest preserved the illusion of divine purity, but it carried a biological cost that even the mightiest kings could not escape. It turned golden dynasties into fragile lineages trapped between myth and mortality. The physical suffering of Egypt's inbred royals is written in their bones. But perhaps even more haunting is the suffering we cannot excavate, the turmoil of the mind, the burden of identity, and the crushing solitude that came with being both god and prisoner of blood. Pharaohs were trapped within a paradox. They were exalted as divine, yet their very divinity stripped them of freedom. Where ordinary Egyptians could marry for companionship, affection, or alliance across families, the pharaoh had no such liberty. The throne demanded he marry his sister or even his daughter in order to preserve the illusion of divine continuity. What did this mean for the human being beneath the crown? Imagine being a teenage girl in the palace, declared the great royal wife to your brother. Your body is no longer yours, it is property of the state. A tool for political theology. Love, desire, even disgust vanish before the weight of ritual necessity. You become mother and aunt, sister, and queen all at once. Each child you bear carries tangled titles, and each pregnancy is a gamble between strengthening the dynasty or producing another frail heir. For the men, the weight was no lighter. Tutankhamun, frail and barely able to walk, was married off to his half-sister Ankhesenamun before reaching adulthood. To the outside world, their union symbolized divine continuity. To the couple themselves, it may have been a mixture of duty and despair. Did they whisper words of comfort in private, or did they carry the silence of two souls bound more by obligation than affection? The practice also shaped the pharaoh's self-image. To be divine meant existing in isolation. Few could truly stand as equals, for only blood of the same sacred line was deemed worthy. This narrowed circle meant that the pharaoh lived in a gilded cage, surrounded by opulence but deprived of genuine companionship. Every smile in the palace might mask calculation, every embrace might conceal ambition. Rivalries between siblings were intensified by the dual roles of kinship and political competition. Brother could be husband, but also rival for the throne. Sister could be queen, but also threat to succession. Consider Cleopatra Sesson, who shared the throne with younger brothers, Ptolemy XIII and XIV. Both of whom were also her husbands in the eyes of Egyptian law. Contemporary accounts hint at tension, rivalry, and betrayal. Cleopatra maneuvered skillfully, but such a life required constant vigilance, a mind honed for intrigue, and perhaps a heart hardened against normal attachments. Love became inseparable from strategy. Family became inseparable from politics. The psychological toll of this system cannot be overstated. A ruler could never truly trust their closest kin because kinship itself was corrupted by politics. A wife might plot for her son's succession. A brother-husband might be both partner and enemy. The sacred duty to preserve divine blood turned every relationship into a chessboard. Beyond the palace walls, ordinary Egyptians may have looked at these unions with awe, confusion, or even unease. To peasants who married within villages, the pharaoh's marriages were both distant and alien, a divine mystery beyond human understanding. But for those inside the palace, there was no mystery, only necessity. And necessity can feel like a curse. What happens to a soul raised to believe it is divine, yet confined by rules that deny basic human choice? Loneliness becomes inevitable. The pharaoh sat atop a pyramid of power, yet at its summit there was space for only one. Even spouses were siblings, bound more by decree than desire. Friends could be conspirators. Children could be rivals. In the end, the divine ruler may have been the most isolated figure in the kingdom. Perhaps this is why Egyptian kings poured such resources into the afterlife. In their tombs, they imagined eternal companionship with gods free from earthly betrayals. In the underworld, there were no sibling marriages, no political unions, only eternal harmony. The tombs of the pharaohs were not just monuments to power, they were escape routes from the burdens of divine blood. The irony of Egypt's incestuous dynasties is tragic. In striving to preserve the sacred line of gods, they created rulers who were both biologically fragile and emotionally imprisoned. The golden masks hide twisted spines. The hymns of praise drown out whispers of loneliness. The temples carved in stone proclaim eternity, but the hearts within the palace beat with fear, desire, and isolation. Divinity demanded incest. Incest bred fragility. Fragility demanded ever more desperate rituals of eternity. It was a cycle that bound Egypt's rulers tighter with each generation, until time itself broke the chain and the gods were revealed as mortals after all. When we think of ancient Egypt, one image towers above all others. The pyramids, their sharp silhouettes cutting into the desert sky. These monumental tombs were not simply graves. They were engines of immortality, vast machines designed to carry pharaohs across the veil between life and death. For the Egyptians, death was not an ending, but a transformation. And for the pharaoh, this transformation carried cosmic weight. The king was more than mortal. He was Horus in life, Osiris in death, destined to merge with the sun god, Ra, and sail across the sky for eternity. His passing was not personal alone. It was a moment of cosmic reordering. If the pharaoh did not transition correctly, the balance of the entire universe, the Ma'at or sacred order, could collapse. Thus his death became a project for the whole nation. The preparation for this journey began long before the final breath. Pharaohs often commissioned their tombs at the very start of their reigns, sometimes even earlier, if they were crown princes. Building a tomb was not a side project, it was the central work of kingship. To walk through the Valley of the Kings today is to step into a library of eternity where each painted wall, each hieroglyph was part of a script meant to guide the soul through the treacherous terrain of the afterlife. The Pyramid Age of the Old Kingdom revealed the first blueprint of this ambition. Pharaohs like Khufu and Khafra erected structures so massive that even in ruin they dwarf human imagination. These pyramids were not meant to be seen merely as tombs, but as stairways to the heavens. The shafts cut into their sides were aligned with stars, guiding the king's soul to join the imperishable lights of the northern sky. Inside the burial chambers were sealed containing sarcophagi carved of stone treasure and texts designed to protect and empower the ruler beyond death. Later dynasties moved away from pyramids, partly because of security concerns. Massive tombs made too visible a target for thieves. Instead, pharaohs turned to hidden burial sites, the rock-cut tombs of the Valley of the Kings. Here, secrecy became a new kind of magic. Tunnels snaked into cliffs, ending in chambers painted with vivid murals. These murals were not art for art's sake, but maps of the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. The pharaoh would need to pass through 12 gates, face monsters, cross rivers of fire, and finally unite with the sun. Without the right spells and rituals, the journey could end in eternal darkness. But burial architecture was only one part of preparation. Equally important was the body itself. Egyptians believed that the soul was composed of multiple parts: the K, life force; the Spai, individual personality; the Ache, the radiant spirit. For these to survive, the body had to remain intact as a vessel. Thus, mummification was not superstition, but a science of eternity. Priests carefully removed organs, dried the body with natron, and wrapped it in linen infused with resins. Each step was accompanied by prayers, turning the corpse into a sacred object. Amulets were slipped between the wrapping scarabs, for rebirth, eyes of Horus; for protection, ankhs; for life. The final wrapping created not just a preserved body, but a magically charged form ready to receive the soul. The mummy was then placed inside nested coffins, often 3 or more each, painted with protective texts. The outer coffin might bear the face of the pharaoh, serene and divine, a promise that in eternity he would transcend frailty. Tutankhamun's golden mask, for example, was more than a portrait. It was a spell, its inlaid lapis and quartz functioning as talismans. The mask declared, "You are Ra, shining forever." Alongside the body went grave goods. These were not tokens of sentiment, but essential tools for survival in the afterlife. Food offerings, jars of beer and wine and bread, shaped in symbolic forms, ensured sustenance. Weapons, furniture, and chariots provided power. Miniature figurines called shabtis stood ready as servants. If the king were called upon to labor in the fields of Osiris, the shabtis would spring to life and work in his stead. One detail often overlooked is the role of curses. Inscribed in some tombs were warnings to intruders, threats that desecrating the pharaoh's eternal rest would bring divine punishment. Whether these curses were effective is doubtful, but they reflect how seriously Egyptians took the sanctity of the crossing. To rob a tomb was not just theft, it was an assault on eternity itself. And then came the rituals of burial. The most sacred was the opening of the mouth ceremony, performed by priests wearing masks of Anubis, the jackal god of the dead. With ritual instruments, they touched the mummy's mouth and eyes, symbolically restoring its senses. In that moment, the dead king regained breath, speech, and sight not for this world, but for the next. All of this reveals how pharaohs approached death not with fear, but with preparation. Where other cultures feared oblivion, Egypt built a civilization around mastering the art of dying. For the pharaoh, death was not defeat, it was enthronement in eternity. The tomb was not a grave, but a palace for forever. The mummy was not a corpse, but a god in waiting. The journey into the afterlife was not passive, but a trial of power, faith, and identity. To modern eyes, it may seem macabre that so much of Egyptian wealth and labor was poured into preparing for death. Yet to the Egyptians, This was the highest use of resources. The pharaoh was the axis of the world, and his safe passage into the next realm meant the safety of the cosmos itself. Every block of stone, every line of hieroglyph, every offering jar was a vote for the continuity of life, not only for the king, but for all who lived under his sun. Thus, crossing the veil was not only personal salvation, it was national survival. The moment the pharaoh's body was sealed inside his tomb, the most dangerous part of his existence began. Death was not simply eternal sleep, it was a perilous voyage. The Egyptian imagined the Duat, or underworld, as a vast landscape stretching beneath the earth and sky, filled with rivers, deserts, mountains, and monstrous guardians. Here, time itself shifted. A single night's journey mirrored the sun god Ra's daily voyage through darkness, where he fought chaos so that dawn could return. For the pharaoh, entering the Duat meant retracing this cosmic pattern. The journey began with awakening. Once the priests completed the opening of the mouth, the spirit of the king could breathe and speak again. Guided by spells painted on tomb walls drawn from the Book of the Dead, the Book of Gates and the Amduat, the pharaoh's bay soul took flight. It left the still body in the coffin, but hovered nearby, transforming into a bird with a human face. From that moment, the voyage through darkness began. The first obstacle was orientation. The Duat was a maze. Without proper texts, the soul could become lost, wandering forever among shadows. Tomb inscriptions functioned as maps, each room depicting the landscape of a particular hour of night. The Amduat, for instance, divided the underworld into 12 hours, each guarded by serpents, crocodiles, or hybrid demons. For every gate, a secret name or incantation was required. If the pharaoh failed to pronounce it, he risked annihilation. Monsters filled this shadowy realm. There were serpents with flaming breath, giant beetles that devoured souls, and lakes of fire patrolled by demons with knives. Yet these horrors were not merely tests of strength. They were trials of identity. The pharaoh had to prove again and again that he was not just a mortal man, but the divine ruler of Egypt, son of Ra, destined to rise again. At times, the journey resembled a courtroom drama. Judges of the Duat demanded credentials, challenging the soul with riddles. Inscriptions preserved the dialogues, the king declaring, "I am the pure one. I am he who knows the names of the gods." The monsters were not defeated by weapons, but by knowledge. In this sense, literacy was power beyond death. To know the words was to live, to forget them was to vanish. But no trial was greater than the confrontation with Apophis, the great serpent of chaos. Every night, as Ra's solar boat crossed the underworld, Apophis rose from the waters, coiling to devour the light. For the pharaoh identifying with Ra, this battle became personal. Priests back on earth reenacted the fight, stabbing wax effigies of the serpent, burning them, chanting spells to weaken him. In myth, Apophis was slain each night, but he never died permanently. He returned with every sunset, a reminder that chaos was eternal and order had to be defended without end. The pharaoh, even in death, took part in this struggle. His triumph over Apophis was not only his salvation, it was the renewal of the cosmos. If he survived the serpent, the king still faced the most delicate test of all, the judgment of his heart. Egyptians believed that every deed, every thought was recorded in the heart. In the Hall of Two Truths, the pharaoh's heart was weighed against the feather of Maat, goddess of truth and cosmic order. If the heart was heavy with lies or injustice, the creature Amit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, would devour it, condemning the soul to oblivion. For ordinary Egyptians, this judgment was terrifying. They had to live ethical lives to hope for balance. But for the pharaoh, the test carried even greater stakes. If his heart failed, he could not ascend to godhood. He would not join Ra, and the divine cycle that sustained Egypt would fracture. Thus, the burial rituals included amulets like the heart scarab inscribed with spells, begging the heart not to betray its owner. The famous Spell 30b of the Book of the Dead pleads, "Do not stand up against me as a witness. Do not tell lies against me in the presence of the great God." Yet Egyptian faith was built on confidence, not fear. The tomb murals did not imagine the pharaoh failing, but triumphing. In artwork, the king is always shown passing the trials, always depicted as justified, true of voice. In these images, we see both propaganda and belief propaganda, because the king must be perfect in the eyes of his people. Belief because Egyptians truly saw their ruler as divine, incapable of eternal failure. The journey through the Duat also mirrored the natural cycles Egyptians saw daily. Just as the Nile rose and fell, bringing both destruction and fertility, so too did death carry the promise of rebirth. Just as the sun sank in fire at dusk and rose in glory at dawn, so too did the pharaoh die and rise again. The Duat was terrifying, yes, but it was also familiar. It was the cosmic night, and like all nights, it ended in morning. Still, the process demanded vigilance. The Duat was filled with distractions, illusions, false doors, voices of the damned crying out in temptation. The pharaoh's car, his life force, needed nourishment. Offerings placed in the tomb bred beer, roasted meat were not mere symbols, but sustenance for the journey. Priests continued to bring food to the mortuary temples for years after the burial, ensuring the car never weakened. At last, after passing the 12 hours of the night, after slaying Apophis, after standing in judgment, the pharaoh reached the gates of dawn. Here he merged with the solar bark of Ra, becoming one with the god. The transformation was total. The man who had been king of Egypt was now reborn as a divine presence, shining across the heavens. From then on, each sunrise was not only the victory of Ra, it was also the return of the dead pharaoh, renewed forever. This final ascent was more than myth. For Egyptians, it explained why their world continued to function. Crops grew, the Nile flooded, the sun returned, and the stars turned, all because their king had conquered death and now stood guard over eternity. His triumph in the underworld was a cosmic guarantee that chaos would never fully win. Yet beneath this confidence lingered anxiety. Tomb builders and priests layered on spell after spell, amulet after amulet, as if they feared that even kings might falter. This paradox, the certainty of divine victory, alongside the obsessive preparation for failure, captures the Egyptian view of death. It was both utterly secure and dangerously fragile. The pharaoh would rise, yes, but only if everything was done correctly. Thus, the pharaoh's crossing of the Duat was not a private journey, but a national drama. Every Egyptian who carved a hieroglyph, who poured an offering, who prayed at a temple, participated in it. When the king conquered the underworld, the people conquered it with him. His rebirth was their rebirth. His eternity was their eternity. When the pharaoh successfully crossed the Duat and emerged with the rising sun, he did not simply return to life. He was transformed. In Egyptian thought, this transformation was not symbolic but literal. The mortal king ceased to exist, and in his place stood a god. This moment apotheosis was the ultimate goal of kingship. All the elaborate rituals, all the tomb paintings and funerary texts, all the treasures sealed away underground, pointed toward this one achievement: the pharaoh's eternal divinity. The Egyptians held a dual vision of their king. During life, he was both man and god. He ruled as Horus, the falcon god protector of order, son of Osiris. He was also the good god, a divine being who walked the earth in flesh. Yet mortality could not be ignored. Pharaohs aged, grew ill, and died. At death, the divine part of the king needed to be transferred, renewed, and magnified. Apotheosis solved the problem. One of the most powerful myths guiding this transformation was the story of Osiris. Once Osiris was king of Egypt, beloved but betrayed by his brother Seth. Murdered and dismembered Osiris was restored by his wife Isis, who reassembled his body and resurrected him as lord of the underworld. His son Horus then avenged him and ruled on earth. For Egyptians, every pharaoh repeated this myth. In life, he was Horus. In death, he became Osiris. But unlike ordinary Osiris, who remained confined to the Duat, the royal Osiris was destined to ascend, uniting with Ra and joining the cycle of the cosmos. This is why tomb walls overflowed with images of the king standing before Osiris, receiving the crook and flail, the symbols of divine authority. These were not fantasies but assurances. They told the universe itself, this man has passed the trials. He is Osiris. He is justified. With that, the pharaoh claimed the throne of eternity. The transformation was not passive. The deceased king underwent rituals of becoming, often depicted in texts like the Book of the Dead. He declared, "I am the great god self-created. I am Atum at his rising." These words were not metaphors. Egyptians believed speech had magical force. By proclaiming himself Atum or Ra or Horus, the king became those gods. The very act of naming brought reality into being. At the same time, the king's body was integrated into cosmic geography. His tomb was not just a grave, but a piece of the universe. The burial chamber represented the womb of Nut, the sky goddess, painted with stars so that the king rested in her body. The sarcophagus became a miniature shrine inscribed with protective deities. Even the pyramids, centuries earlier, had been designed as resurrection machines. Massive stone staircases launching the king toward the heavens. Later, rock-cut tombs carried the same symbolism, painted with solar boats, star charts, and portals to the beyond. The apotheosis also redefined the pharaoh's relationship to his people. While alive, he was ruler of Egypt. Dead, He became ruler of everything. His cult expanded beyond the palace and battlefield into eternity itself. Priests tended to his mortuary temple, presenting daily offerings to sustain his ka. Festivals reenacted his union with Osiris and Ra, reminding the people that their king still protected them even from beyond the grave. This was not empty theater. Egyptians believed that divine favor and cosmic balance, Ma'at, depended directly on the pharaoh's successful transformation. If he failed, chaos would consume the world. Perhaps the most striking expression of apotheosis lay in the stars. The Egyptians called them the imperishable ones, eternal lights that never faded from the northern sky. Pharaohs were often depicted ascending among these stars, taking their place as shining guardians. Texts from the Pyramid Age already declared, "The king is a star son of a star. He will live forever like Orion in the sky." Over time, this idea blended with solar theology. The king was not just a star, but the sun itself, reborn every day. Thus, every sunrise was both cosmic and personal. It was Ra's triumph, but also the dead pharaoh's eternal victory. And yet this transformation carried a paradox. In becoming divine, the pharaoh also left behind his humanity. To his subjects, he was now distant, invisible, existing in a realm they could not reach until their own deaths. But this distance was balanced by intimacy. Through statues, stelae, and rituals, Egyptians could communicate with their departed king. Letters written on papyrus or inscribed on bowls begged deceased rulers or nobles for help in disputes, health or fertility. The dead remained active participants in the living world. For a pharaoh, this intercession was magnified, his power stretched across the horizon into the duat and out into the sky. Archaeological evidence underscores how seriously Egyptians took this divine status. Mortuary temples were not abandoned after burial. Generations of priests maintained them, and common people left offerings, prayers, and petitions. Kings like Ramses II or Amenhotep III were venerated for centuries, their cults blending with those of gods like Amun or Ptah. Apotheosis blurred into deification. Pharaohs did not just become gods in the afterlife, they were gods in life, whose worship only intensified after death. The Egyptian worldview made this seamless. Time for them was not linear but cyclical. Just as the sun rose and set eternally, so too did kingship rotate between life and death, mortal and divine. One pharaoh died, another took his place, but all shared the same essence: Horus, living Osiris, dead Ra, reborn. This endless cycle was the engine of Egyptian stability. It is important to remember that the pharaoh's apotheosis was not a private matter of faith, but a public and political reality. It legitimized the successor who claimed the throne as the new Horus and of the now divine Osiris. It reassured the people that order had not collapsed, and it sanctified the land itself, for Egypt was not merely a kingdom, but a sacred space where gods and men intersected. In the end, apotheosis meant victory not only for the king, but for the entire civilization. Through his death and transformation, Egypt's cosmic order endured. The fields would yield grain, the Nile would flood, The stars would shine and the sun would rise. The Pharaoh was dead, but Egypt was eternal because he had become eternal. Even after apotheosis, the Pharaoh's presence did not vanish. His divine essence lingered, woven into Egypt's temples, festivals, and landscapes. Farmers ploughing their fields or sailors casting their nets believed the king's spirit safeguarded them, for he had become a guardian of cosmic order. Each sunrise reminded Egyptians that their pharaoh now sailed with Ra, ensuring light's victory over darkness. Mortuary temples acted as living bridges between the dead king and the living people. Priests offered bread, beer, and incense, daily sustaining the royal car, while pilgrims left petitions trusting that a deified ruler could grant favors more swiftly than any mortal judge. Over time, some pharaohs grew into popular gods in their own right. Amenhotep was worshipped as a protective deity. Ramses II, remembered as the great ancestor, was honored long after his death. This continuity ensured that kingship itself became eternal. Each new ruler inherited not only a throne, but a divine lineage, a chain stretching unbroken across centuries. Through apotheosis, the pharaohs promised Egypt that death was never an ending, but a renewal. The king became eternal, and so too did Egypt. For over 2 millennia, the pharaoh stood as the axis of Egypt's universe, living god, judge, priest, and warrior. Yet by the late New Kingdom, the aura of divine kingship began to fracture. The collapse was not sudden, but gradual, like sand slipping from a pyramid stone by stone. What had once seemed eternal slowly revealed its fragility. One cause was economic strain. Egypt's empire reached its zenith under the warrior pharaohs of the 18th and 19th dynasties. But constant military campaigns, lavish temple constructions, and extravagant tombs drained the treasury. Maintaining divinity was expensive. The king's godlike image required endless rituals, festivals, and offerings. Temples grew into economic juggernauts, owning farmland, cattle, and workshops. As priests amassed wealth, their influence rivaled the king's. The most powerful of these, the priests of Amun at Thebes, commanded resources equal to the crown itself. The divine monopoly was breaking. At the same time, foreign invasions undermined the pharaoh's aura. The Libyans, peoples, Nubians, and later Assyrians tested Egypt's borders. For a ruler to claim divinity, he had to guarantee cosmic order, Ma'at. But repeated defeats made it clear that the gods were no longer granting the pharaoh invincibility. Ordinary Egyptians saw famine, instability, and loss of lands once conquered by their ancestors. The king, once protector, now appeared vulnerable. The problem was worsened by succession crises. Inbreeding had already weakened dynasties, producing heirs who died young or reigned briefly. Tutankhamun, Smenkhkare, and others became symbols of fragility rather than eternity. Even Ramses II, who reigned for nearly 7 decades, left behind a tangle of sons and grandsons whose short rules accelerated decline. A divine king who died suddenly or who failed to produce a stable heir shattered the illusion of godhood, and so the cracks spread. The divine pharaoh was still worshipped, still carved into temple walls, but the image no longer matched the lived reality. Kingship was becoming mortal again, whether Egypt wished it or not. As the new kingdom faded, the godlike pharaoh faced his most dangerous rivals, not foreign conquerors, but Egypt's own priests. The institution that had once legitimized divine rule began to consume it. At the heart of this power shift was the cult of Amun. From the 18th dynasty onward, Thebes rose as Egypt's spiritual capital, and Amun's temples became vast estates. With every donation of land, every conquered treasure offered after war, the priesthood expanded its reach. By the late Ramesside period, the high priest of Amun was effectively a second pharaoh. His control over wealth, labor, and rituals gave him a stranglehold on Egyptian politics. The divine image of the king was fading, replaced by the quiet but overwhelming reality of priestly rule. This transition was both subtle and catastrophic. Pharaohs had once been the sole mediators, with the gods their bodies vessels of the divine. Now priests began performing that role openly, sometimes even more convincingly. They could declare oracles, stage processions, and interpret Amun's will. People seeking justice, fertility, or healing often turned to temple priests instead of the king. In effect, the monopoly of divinity was broken. The god had many servants. The pharaoh was only one of them. Some kings resisted. Ramses XI, the last pharaoh of the new kingdom, attempted to curb the priesthood's authority, but his reign only accelerated fragmentation. By the time he died, Egypt had split. Lower Egypt governed by military officials in the Delta, and Upper Egypt ruled by high priests of Amun. The once unified cosmic kingdom of the pharaoh was shattered into rival fiefdoms. In later centuries, pharaohs still wore the crowns and performed rituals, but their godlike aura was increasingly ceremonial. During the Third Intermediate Period, Libyan warlords, Kushite kings, and local strongmen all claimed the title of pharaoh. Their rule proved that kingship was now political theater rather than divine mandate. A Kushite could wear the double crown, a Libyan could be styled as Horus incarnate. Godhood had become transferable, a costume rather than a reality. This erosion of sacred kingship culminated during the late period. When Persian emperors conquered Egypt in the 6th century BCE, they too adopted pharaonic titles. Darius I presented himself as the upholder of Ma'at, but the illusion fooled few. Egyptians could see the truth. Foreign conquerors did not bleed like gods. They ruled by force of arms, not divine sanction. The pharaoh's divinity had been hollowed out. And yet, paradoxically, the idea of divine kingship never fully vanished. Even when diminished, it was too deeply woven into Egypt's cultural fabric. Temples continued to depict rulers smiting enemies beneath Horus's falcon gaze. Coronation rituals were still performed, but the theater of divinity no longer carried the same conviction. What had once been a truth was now a performance. The people of Egypt adapted to this new reality. They still prayed, still offered incense, still appealed to rulers as semi-divine protectors. But in private, many turned more fervently to local gods, household spirits, and personal amulets. The pharaoh was no longer enough. Divine kingship, once absolute, had fractured into a mosaic of beliefs. The fall of pharaohs was not a collapse in one dramatic moment, but a slow, centuries-long fading. By the time Alexander the Great marched into Egypt in 332 BCE, the idea of the pharaoh as a god was little more than a shadow. The last breath of that divine illusion was yet to come, but the weakening of faith had already prepared Egypt for foreign crowns. By the late Ptolemaic period, Egypt's pharaohs were no longer native sons of the Nile. They were Greeks, descendants of Ptolemy, a general of Alexander the Great. Yet even these foreign rulers wore the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt, performed the ancient rituals, and had their names carved into temple walls beside Horus and Ra. The persistence of pharaonic imagery shows how deeply embedded the divine kingship remained even when its substance had crumbled. Cleopatra, 7. The most famous of all epitomized this paradox. To her Greek subjects in Alexandria, she was a queen in the Hellenistic style, educated, politically astute, fluent in multiple languages. But to her Egyptian subjects, she was Pharaoh Isis incarnate, chosen to restore Ma'at. Cleopatra embraced both identities, presenting herself in traditional Egyptian dress on temple walls, offering incense to the gods of the Nile. Yet the spectacle was more necessity than belief. By her time, Rome loomed as the true arbiter of Egyptian fate. Divinity had become a mask for diplomacy. The end came not with a dramatic renunciation of kingship, but with defeat. After Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE, Egypt fell under Roman rule. The emperors of Rome, like the Persians before them, adopted the trappings of pharaonic ritual. Augustus styled himself as pharaoh in official inscriptions, and temples continued to be built with his cartouche. Yet this was imperial propaganda, not sincere devotion. The emperor in distant Rome had no need to mediate between Egyptians and their gods. Divine kingship had become a fossil, preserved but lifeless. The silence that followed is telling. For 3,000 years, Egyptians had believed their ruler was a living god. Suddenly, that belief was gone. Priests still performed daily rites in temples, but the pharaoh's body no longer stood at the center of the cosmos. The world did not collapse. The Nile still flooded, crops still grew. Life continued. In a way, this was the most devastating revelation of all. The gods did not need the pharaoh after all. Yet even in death, the pharaoh's divinity lingered in memory. Tombs and temples continued to awe foreign visitors, Greeks, Romans, later travelers who marveled at colossal statues of kings who had once been gods. The ruined temples whispered of a time when humans could ascend to divinity, when a man's name could live forever, carved in stone. This memory preserved the idea of sacred kingship long after its political function had ended. What the decline of the pharaohs reveals is that divinity, once tethered to power, can unravel when faith collapses. A god-king cannot survive repeated defeats, economic ruin, or loss of trust. People may cling to rituals, but belief is fragile. When the performance of divinity no longer convinces, the god becomes mortal again. The final irony is that pharaohs once worshipped as eternal proved as vulnerable to time as their subjects. Their mummies decayed, their temples fell, their names were forgotten, until archaeologists unearthed them millennia later. In life they were gods, in history they are dust. And yet, in our imagination, they remain immortal symbols of ambition, grandeur, and the dangerous allure of absolute power. Thus ended the age of divine kingship in Egypt, not with thunder but with silence, not with eternal glory but with a slow fading into memory. The pharaohs, once gods on earth, became legends, carved into stone and stories whispered across centuries. For more than 3,000 years, Egypt's pharaohs stood at the center of a grand illusion, one in which a mortal man could embody a god, command nature, and guarantee cosmic balance. From the earliest dynasties to the last breath of Cleopatra, the pharaoh was presented as eternal, flawless, and divine. Yet behind the golden masks and monumental temples lay a more disturbing truth. These rulers were human and their divinity was fragile. We have seen how pharaohs used ritual, myth, and spectacle to transform themselves into living gods. We have traced their daily lives of luxury and paranoia, their family intrigues, their ruthless power, and their desperate search for immortality through pyramids and tombs. We have also seen their failures, the famines they could not stop, the rebellions they could not control, the invasions that stripped away their aura of invincibility. In those moments, the cracks in divinity became visible, and the god-king appeared painfully mortal. The story of Egypt's pharaohs is not simply about kings and temples, it is about the human hunger for power and permanence. It reminds us how belief can elevate a man into a god, and how swiftly disbelief can strip him bare. The monuments still stand, the mummies still endure, but the divine kingship that once defined Egypt has faded into silence. In the end, the disturbing legacy of the pharaohs is that they were both gods and men, immortal and mortal, sacred and flawed. Their lives reveal not only the grandeur of ancient Egypt, but also the fragility of human ambition when dressed in the robes of eternity.